It was in the quiet chambers of a London cutting room early in the 20th century that Alma Reville was first seen bending over strips of celluloid, her hands moving with unerring certainty, as though she were stitching together fragments of time itself. The noise of the projector filled the air like a steady heartbeat, and though few in that moment knew her name, history was already shifting under her careful touch. We shall begin here, dear listener, with the flicker of shadow and light, for it is in silence that some of the most enduring voices of cinema were first born. Welcome, wanderer of memory. Tell us, if you will, in the comments below, when and where you listened to these words, for in doing so, you join a gathering of souls scattered across the globe, each one adding their note to this shared chorus of recollection. And before we begin the long unfolding of this tale, I ask gently that you subscribe to Timeless History Documents so that together we may keep these stories alive. Alma Reville was born on the 14th day of August in the year 1899 in the city of Nottingham, a place of narrow streets and brick houses pressed close together, where the air carried both the scent of coal smoke and the faint sweetness of garden roses grown in small yards. She came into the world at the very end of one century and at the fragile beginning of another, a century that would be marked by machines of speed, by towers of steel, and by moving images that would change forever the way human beings dream. To imagine Alma as a child in that time is to picture a girl walking through cobbled lanes, her eyes drawn not only to the people around her, but also to the play of shadow against wall, to the way morning light curved across the rooftops. There was a sharpness to her gaze, though no one yet knew how important such attentiveness would become. Her father, Matthew, worked upon the railway, and his world was one of timetables, punctuality, and the rhythm of trains that rumbled through stations with whistles that pierced the air. Perhaps it was from him that she inherited her precise sense of order, the conviction that every piece must fit, that every cut must be exact. Her mother, Alice, tended to the home with quiet steadiness, and in that domestic world, Alma was nurtured in discipline and patience, virtues that would later steady her in an industry as chaotic and fragile as cinema itself. Childhood in Nottingham was not extravagant, yet it offered her enough. There were church bells on Sundays, the market stalls where merchants called out their wares, and in winter the smell of coal stoves that warmed the neighborhood streets. These ordinary impressions, etched into her memory, would form the unseen palette from which she later drew her subtle sense of realism. The year of her birth placed her at a threshold. Just 4 years before, in Paris, the brothers Lumière had astonished crowds with their first public projection of moving pictures. By the time she was learning her letters, the flickering images had crossed into Britain, showing scenes of trains arriving, workers leaving factories, people simply walking across streets, everyday life captured and replayed as though reality itself could be held in the hand. These early films were novelties for some, yet for children like Alma, who grew up in their glow, they were portents of a new form of seeing. Imagine her as a girl, perhaps taken by her parents to a makeshift cinema where the images trembled on a white sheet, the crowd gasping at the sudden illusion of movement. What did she feel? Did she sense even then that this strange craft would be her own? We cannot know, but it is tempting to wonder, for her life would become bound to those flickering shadows more tightly than to anything else. Schooling gave her literacy and the patterns of language, but Alma's education would be carried further by the streets of London, to which her family moved while she was still young. London was vast, crowded, pulsing with industry and noise. There the new century unfolded with clanging trams, with shop front windows gleaming with goods, with fog that rolled thick across the Thames. For a girl of her quick mind, such a city was a school in itself. She noticed gestures, overheard phrases, measured how silence lingered after a remark. Later, as she sat before reels of film, such observations would whisper to her, telling her what felt true, what must be trimmed away, what deserved to remain. When Alma was still in her teens, the film industry in Britain was blossoming into a lively, if unstable, field. Studios sprang up in converted buildings, full of noise and experiment. Here, young men and women carried reels, adjusted lights, shifted scenery. Work was plentiful for the willing, and it was in this atmosphere that Alma found her entrance, humble though it seemed. She began as what was called a tea girl, carrying cups to workers, performing errands. It was lowly labor, yet it allowed her to linger in the cutting rooms, to watch the editors at work. There the strips of film were handled with delicate fingers, measured and trimmed, joined with glue and tape, then threaded once more into the projector. The process fascinated her. Each decision made by the editor altered the story, stretched or compressed time, shifted meaning itself. She saw how the smallest cut could create suspense, how the removal of one frame could change an emotion entirely. It was in those dim rooms, smelling faintly of chemicals and warmed by the hum of machinery, that Alma began to form her true education. She was quick, observant, and soon the superiors noticed her eye for continuity. She could remember the tilt of a hat between shots, the position of a hand, the way an expression must match from one angle to another. Errors invisible to others shouted at her, and she quietly corrected them. This sense of precision, born perhaps from her father's world of trains and timetables, grew into the cornerstone of her craft. And yet, beyond skill, there was within her a sensibility harder to name. It was not enough to make a film coherent. She seemed to feel the rhythm of story itself, the invisible pulse that held images together. She would watch a sequence and know instinctively whether it moved too quickly or too slowly, whether the breath of suspense had been held too long or released too soon. At a time when cinema was still learning its own language, Alma already spoke it with fluency. What must it have felt like to be a young woman in that world, surrounded by men who often dismissed such contributions as mere technicalities? Did she know even then that her eye, her timing, her instinct for story would one day shape films that millions would watch? Or did she simply take quiet satisfaction in the work itself, never needing applause? The record does not say, and so we are left to imagine. In the hush of those early cutting rooms, with strips of silent film running between her fingers, Alma Reville was becoming, slowly and without fanfare, one of the most skilled editors of her generation. And as the reels spun on, their flicker filled her nights and days, until it seemed the rhythm of film was indistinguishable from the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls of the studio, a projector whirred on. Its sound like the breath of a new century, carrying with it a future she could not yet name. The whirring of the projector faded into silence, and in its place came the restless stir of footsteps across studio floors, the clatter of reels set upon tables, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea drifting through the corridors of the London studios. It was here, amid such bustling sounds and scents, that Alma Reville's life as a young worker in film truly began to take shape. She was no longer a child gazing at flickering shadows with wonder. She was now a girl of 16 or 17, moving with intent among technicians, secretaries, and assistants, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, her place within the strange new kingdom of cinema slowly hardening into permanence. Her earliest position was modest, that of a tea girl in general aid, yet it was one of those roles that allowed her to pass unnoticed through every corner of the studio. She observed the actors rehearsing lines, their voices echoing against bare walls, and saw the way directors barked commands with more confidence than certainty. She lingered near the cutting rooms, where film strips were being measured, cut and spliced with a craftsman's care. There she felt most at home, for she understood that the true magic of film resided not merely in performance or scenery, but in the way images were joined. An awkward sequence could be transformed into elegance. A dull scene could tremble with suspense if only the rhythm were right. Her tasks were simple, yet her eyes learned endlessly. Soon she became a script clerk, charged with following the progress of dialogue, noting changes in scene, and above all, ensuring continuity. It was unglamorous work, demanding patience, diligence, and a near photographic memory. Alma possessed all these qualities in abundance. She saw that a misplaced prop, a mismatched gesture, a shadow falling differently from one angle to another, could shatter the illusion for the careful viewer. Others shrugged at such lapses, but Alma could not. To her, the harmony of detail was sacred. She caught errors before they reached the screen, and her reputation grew. The men around her, though reluctant at first, began to trust her quiet verdicts. There is something profound in the image of this young woman seated at a desk, pencil in hand, listening as a director explained his vision, her eyes already scanning the script for weaknesses. Did she know, as she marked lines and corrected errors, that she was shaping the very grammar of cinema? Perhaps not, for she never sought glory. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed the firmness of her expression, the sense that here was someone who understood the fragile art better than most. These were the days of the silent film, when every expression had to be exaggerated just enough to be read by the audience, and yet not so much that it became grotesque. Alma studied these performances carefully, aware of how editing could soften an overdone gesture or prolong the tension of a still moment. She learned to anticipate the needs of story, to feel instinctively when the audience required release or surprise. Though her name appeared nowhere on posters, though applause never followed her home, the essence of her craft was already at work in shaping the experiences of those who watched. London in those years was not without hardship. The Great War had left scars upon families and upon the economy. Men who returned from the front carried wounds both seen and unseen. The city was restless, yearning for escape. Film offered that escape, and the studios worked feverishly to provide it. Alma moved among colleagues who carried both ambition and fatigue, but she seemed to steady herself with an inner composure. Her wit, quiet and sharp, offered relief in tense moments. More than once she disarmed a boastful superior with a single dry remark, her eyes glinting with restrained amusement. In a field dominated by strong personalities, her calm steadiness became a kind of anchor. In this environment, she formed early friendships, many fleeting, some enduring. Editors and writers recognized in her a mind that could balance discipline with imagination. She was not a dreamer in the romantic sense, but her sensitivity to story and rhythm revealed an imagination of a different sort, one that preferred structure, one that sought beauty in order rather than chaos. Perhaps this is why she felt such kinship with the craft of editing, for editing itself is the art of shaping chaos into meaning. It is said that Alma's diligence and skill eventually brought her to the attention of directors who trusted her judgment. Graham Cutts, one of Britain's prominent filmmakers of the time, found her invaluable on set. She worked on Woman to Woman, 1923, a film that demanded care and precision. While many young women of her age might have dreamed of appearing before the camera, Alma's dream lay behind it, in the invisible weaving of story. She had little taste for celebrity, but much for craft. Watching her work, colleagues understood that she was no mere assistant, but an essential presence. And it was here, amid the crowded work of Woman to Woman, that Alma first encountered a young man named Alfred Hitchcock. At the time, he was an assistant art director, sketching designs and adjusting backdrops, his round face serious, his ambitions fierce. Their first meetings were simple exchanges, little more than nods or brief words, yet something unspoken passed between them. Both were young, both were learning, both were observing the world of cinema with voracious hunger. Perhaps Alma noticed the intensity in his eyes, the way he studied each scene with curiosity. Perhaps Hitchcock, in turn, noticed her steadiness, her refusal to be swept away by vanity or noise. At first they were simply two workers among many, their paths crossing in the common labor of film. But fate, silent and unseen, had already bound them together. The clamor of the studio was unending. Cameras whirred, lights heated the air until it seemed to tremble, and actors repeated their gestures until perfection or exhaustion was reached. Yet amid this chaos, Alma maintained her composure. She checked scripts, corrected details, advised when asked. Her quiet voice carried surprising authority, for it was grounded in knowledge. She did not demand attention, but attention came to her nonetheless, drawn by the certainty of her judgments. The young Hitchcock, still learning his place, must have felt the steadiness of her presence, though neither could have guessed how essential that presence would one day become to his art. What is it like to live at the very beginning of a medium when its rules are still being discovered? Imagine being there, watching as the grammar of film slowly forms each cut and dissolve a new invention. Alma was there. She did not simply watch, she participated, her decisions shaping the very language that future generations would take for granted. And yet she did so without seeking credit, without insisting upon her own name. Her legacy was already being written in the silence of those cutting rooms, in the precision of scripts marked with her careful hand. The scent of celluloid lingered in the corridors, sharp and chemical, mingling with the warmth of teacups carried by assistants. The sound of reels clattering upon wooden tables echoed down hallways. And through it all, Alma moved with calm intent, her eyes missing nothing, her hands always ready to correct, adjust, improve. In such details her reputation grew, and in such details her future was being shaped. The day would come when her influence would extend far beyond continuity notes, when her suggestions would alter the direction of entire films. But for now, she was still young, still learning, still finding her place in a restless industry. And as she walked through those corridors, the faint scent of celluloid followed her like an invisible cloak, a reminder of the world she had chosen and the art that had chosen her. The scent of celluloid lingered still, sharp and faintly acrid, clinging to Alma's clothes as she left the studios each evening and walked the streets of London. It was not the perfume of flowers or of fine powders, but the mark of her craft, the odor of reels and chemicals that seemed to bind her to the new world she was helping to shape. In the quiet of her small room, she could almost hear again the steady slicing sound of scissors through film, the gentle pull as strips were joined together. Even in sleep, the rhythm of cutting and joining, of assembling and discarding, seemed to echo through her mind like a secret heartbeat. For Alma, editing was not mechanical labor, but a kind of listening, as though the film itself spoke and she merely answered. Each sequence carried its own pulse, and her task was to sense where that pulse beat strongest. A glance that lingered too long could become awkward, but cut too soon it lost its meaning. A movement across a room might require 3 seconds rather than 2. A pause in dialogue might need a fraction longer to release its tension. Such decisions were invisible to audiences, yet shaped everything they felt. Alma learned this quickly, her fingers tracing the joins, her eyes scanning the flow. She was still a young woman, but her instincts belonged to a master. Those who worked alongside her sometimes wondered at her precision. She could recall the smallest details between takes, the angle of a hat, the tilt of a head, the exact moment when an actor lifted a hand. In a time when films were often shot hastily, when scripts were revised mid-scene, Alma became the quiet guardian of continuity. Directors leaned on her to prevent errors that could jolt viewers from their dream. And more than this, she grasped something deeper: continuity of feeling. A story was not simply events strung together. It was emotion carried from one shot to the next. She understood that the audience must never stumble, must never be reminded of the machinery behind the illusion. Her corrections preserved that invisible thread. It was in the mid-1920s, as silent film reached its height, that Alma's reputation as one of Britain's most skilled editors took hold. Studios trusted her with complex projects. Colleagues began to whisper that her eye was unmatched, her judgment sharper than many who claimed greater authority. She never raised her voice, yet her decisions often guided the final shape of films. In the smoke-filled rooms where producers argued and directors despaired, Alma's calm words carried weight. Her presence was not dramatic but decisive. Consider the atmosphere of those cutting rooms. Reels stacked high, strips of film curling on the floor like ribbons, the steady click of projectors throwing images against bare walls. Cigarette smoke clouded the air, typewriters clattered in the distance, and outside the city thundered with traffic. Yet inside these rooms, time itself was being reshaped. Here scenes were shortened or extended, moments of suspense sharpened, jokes tightened, emotions refined. Alma sat amid this chaos, unhurried, her hands steady, her mind attentive. She did not merely assemble what was filmed, she transformed it into story. And yet she was more than an editor. Alma had begun to contribute to the scripts themselves, suggesting changes, smoothing dialogue for intertitles, refining character motivations. She saw that story and editing were inseparable. One informed the other. If a script faltered, the cutting room could not save it. So she stepped quietly into the realm of writing, offering her insight before the cameras even rolled. Her sense of structure, of rhythm, of what audiences could endure or desire, guided the process from the earliest stages. Few acknowledged the breadth of her contribution, but those who worked with her knew. At the same time, Alma was developing a sensibility that would later prove vital to Hitchcock himself, an understanding of suspense. She realized that suspense was not about shocking images or sudden violence, but about timing, about holding a moment just long enough to make the viewer's breath catch. She saw that the unseen could be more powerful than the seen, that suggestion could terrify more than revelation. In the silence of her editing rooms, she was learning the grammar of fear, the rhythm of unease. These lessons would later echo through some of the most celebrated films in history, though her name would rarely be spoken in the same breath. One might imagine her leaving the studio late at night, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of traffic, her footsteps echoing on the pavement. Did she ever wonder if her work would be remembered, if anyone beyond her colleagues would know her name? Or was she content with the knowledge that she had shaped experiences for thousands of unseen strangers in darkened theaters? The truth is lost to us. Alma herself spoke little of ambition, and perhaps she did not need public acclaim. The craft itself may have been her reward, yet it is difficult not to feel the poignancy of such invisibility, for greatness so often goes unacknowledged when it hides behind another's fame. It was during these years that Alma's path and Hitchcock's crossed more often. He too was learning, moving from art direction into writing, and eventually into directing. Their conversations, still brief, hinted at a mutual respect. He admired her clarity, her precision. She noted his intensity, his imagination. Neither yet foresaw the long journey they would take together, but the foundation was quietly laid. In the cutting rooms and script offices, amid the smell of celluloid and the hum of machinery, two lives were circling closer. Silent cinema was itself nearing a transformation. Sound was on the horizon, and with it new challenges. Alma sensed that her skills would be needed even more, for dialogue would introduce new complexities, new opportunities for rhythm and timing. She watched with curiosity as the industry speculated, some fearing the end of cinema's art, others thrilled by the promise. She prepared herself as she always had, by observing, by learning, by sharpening her instincts. The future was uncertain, but Alma had no fear of change. She had built her craft upon the principle of adaptation, and she trusted her own eye. What remains most striking about these years is the quietness of her ascent. There were no grand proclamations, no sudden bursts of fame. She rose through patience, discipline, and a devotion to detail. In an age when women in film were often confined to the margins, Alma carved her place with steady persistence. Her story reminds us that history is often written not only by those who stand in the spotlight, but also by those who guide the light itself, adjusting its angle until it falls with perfection. The projector clicked to a halt, the final reel ending with a soft slap against its reel. The room was still, the smoke lingering, the scissors resting upon the table. Alma gathered her notes, her face calm, her mind already thinking of tomorrow's work. Outside, the city's bells marked the hour, and somewhere in the shadows, beyond the walls, destiny was waiting, its footsteps drawing near, though neither she nor the young Hitchcock could yet hear them clearly. The faint sound of footsteps lingered in the imagination, as though someone unseen had just passed through the smoke-filled corridors and paused at the threshold of Alma's world. Those steps belonged in truth to many young men who wandered into the British studios of the 1920s, but among them was one whose presence would echo most profoundly across her life, Alfred Hitchcock. At the time, he was scarcely more than a young art director, responsible for sketching backdrops and designing title cards, his round face marked by seriousness, his manner reserved yet touched with dry humor. He was not yet the Hitchcock known to the world, only another apprentice learning his place among the machinery of film. And it was within the work on Woman to Woman in 1923, under the director Graham Cutts, that Alma and Alfred first found themselves moving within the same creative orbit. The film itself was a melodrama, one of many produced in Britain to compete with the grand spectacles of American studios. Sets were erected hastily, scripts adjusted on the fly, tempers flared under pressure. Yet amid the chaos, Alma remained steady, her sharp eyes catching errors, her calm hand guiding continuity. She was now editor in truth, no longer the errand girl or script clerk. Her judgment shaped the film's final rhythm, and those who worked with her knew the production would falter without her. Alfred, meanwhile, drafted designs, sketched scenery, and hovered at the edges of directorial authority. It was through these overlapping labors that they first noticed one another, not with sudden revelation, but with the slow recognition that each possessed something the other lacked. Their initial exchanges were brief, words traded in the bustle of sets, glances across cutting rooms. Alma, older by a year, carried herself with quiet authority, while Alfred's ambition simmered beneath a surface of formality. Did she see at once the intensity in his eyes, the hunger to shape stories larger than himself? Did he sense in her the calm precision he lacked, the discipline without which his visions might collapse? We cannot know, but it is certain that respect preceded affection. They met not as lovers, but as colleagues, bound first by craft. The studio air was heavy with the smell of paint and hot lamps. Actors rehearsed dramatic gestures, their silent mouths shaping words that audiences would never hear. The director barked instructions, his voice weary with repetition. Amid all this noise, Alma and Alfred carved a quiet space of recognition. She observed his careful sketches, the way he mapped camera angles in his mind, the seriousness with which he approached even the smallest task. He, in turn, observed her corrections, her unflinching honesty when continuity faltered, her refusal to flatter. It was a meeting not of passion but of kindred spirits, both drawn to the deeper architecture of film. As the days of production wore on, Alma began to see Alfred more clearly. He was shy, socially awkward at times, yet his imagination burned with restless energy. He spoke of ideas beyond the immediate film, of techniques he wished to try, of stories that could be told differently. Alma listened, not always agreeing, but recognizing in him a spark that might grow. She, for her part, shared fewer dreams aloud, yet her contributions revealed a mind equally restless. Where he envisioned, she refined. Where he dreamed, she questioned. It was not yet collaboration, but the roots of it lay hidden beneath these early conversations. Outside the studio, the city of London pulsed with life. Crowds gathered at theaters, eager for new stories to wash away the weariness of post-war years. The streets glowed at night with lamps and the dim aura of cinema marquees. Somewhere among those lights, Alma and Alfred may have walked side by side after long days, discussing the problems of a scene, or perhaps remaining silent, content in the rhythm of shared steps. If affection stirred, it was faint and unspoken, yet companionship had already begun. Alma's work on Woman to Woman further solidified her standing. She was indispensable, her edits transforming rough material into coherent drama. Alfred, though younger and less secure in his role, observed how she commanded respect with quiet authority. It must have impressed him, for he too sought control over story, though his style was more flamboyant. Perhaps in Alma he glimpsed not only skill, but balance, the counterweight he would one day require. And perhaps Alma, watching his ambition, sensed a path that might lead them both forward, though she was not one to indulge in prophecy. The atmosphere of the film set lingered after the project ended. The sound of clattering reels, the rustle of scripts, the murmur of whispered suggestions. Alma returned to her cutting rooms, continuing her craft with the same discipline as before. Alfred moved on to new tasks, climbing steadily toward direction. Yet the memory of their first collaboration remained, a seed planted in soil not yet ready to bloom. To imagine those early encounters is to imagine two instruments slowly finding harmony. Alma's strength was precision, patience, an almost mathematical sense of rhythm. Alfred's was vision, boldness, the willingness to risk disorder in pursuit of effect. Alone, each might have achieved much. Together, they would create a body of work that altered cinema itself. But such futures were hidden, wrapped in the ordinariness of daily labor, in the clatter of scissors and the scratching of pencils. What did Alma think of him in those days? Did she dismiss him as another ambitious young man, or did she already sense the gravity of his presence? And what of Alfred? Did he admire her skill from afar, or did he struggle with the recognition that someone else's judgment might equal or surpass his own? The answers lie beyond our reach, but it is fitting that uncertainty remains, for their story was always a mingling of clarity and mystery. As Woman to Woman reached audiences, the names most celebrated were those of actors and directors. Alma's contribution remained unseen, her name small in the credits if it appeared at all. Yet her influence was there, in every cut, in every transition that carried the audience's heart from one moment to the next. Alfred's influence, too, was still minor, a footnote in the production. And so, though history now speaks their names together, at the time they were only two workers among many, each carving a path through the noise of the studio system. The canteen of the studio, filled with chatter and laughter, often brought them face to face. Cups of tea clinked upon saucers, plates scraped, voices carried across crowded tables. Alma's wit revealed itself here, in short remarks that left companions smiling or silenced. Alfred, who loved both humor and control, must have found her words sharp enough to respect. In such moments their companionship grew, not yet intimate but marked by recognition. Two young souls meeting amid the laughter and clatter, unaware of the vast journey ahead. The laughter lingered after the meal, echoing faintly down the corridors, and as it faded into the silence of the evening studio, Alma returned once more to her editing table, scissors in hand, her eyes upon the frames that would outlast them all. The reel moved forward frame by frame, and the story continued, carrying her deeper into the art she was shaping, without knowing how profoundly it would shape her. The laughter from the canteen drifted away into the dim hallways of the studio, its echo dissolving into silence. And in that silence, Alma bent once more to her work, the scissors resting cool against her fingers, the strips of film laid out like ribbons awaiting her judgment. It was in such moments when the noise of the day had stilled and only the soft hum of the projector filled the room that her mind moved with greatest clarity. She was no longer merely correcting errors, no longer simply safeguarding continuity. By the middle years of the 1920s, Alma Reville had become known in London's film circles as one of the most dependable and discerning minds in the industry. Producers who doubted her at first soon learned to trust her verdict, for she could see flaws that escaped others, not only flaws of detail but of story itself. A scene might be perfectly acted, perfectly shot, yet Alma would remark that it dragged, that its purpose was unclear, that the audience's attention would falter, and when changes were made according to her suggestions, the films flowed more smoothly, the audience remained entranced. Her reputation grew not through loud claims, but through quiet results. She moved from project to project, sharpening her skills, guiding directors who were often older and louder, but rarely as precise. In those years, she began to contribute not only to editing, but also to the structure of scripts. Silent films required intertitles, those brief flashes of text that conveyed dialogue or explained the scene, and Alma had a gift for shaping them. She could condense emotion into a few spare words, elegant without ornament, clear without dullness. Such work demanded both literary skill and an ear for rhythm, for the placement of an intertitle could speed or slow a sequence, could make humor sharper or suspense more taut. Alma approached these decisions with the same care she gave to cuts of film. In this way, she became more than an editor. She was a storyteller, guiding narrative as much as image. Meanwhile, the young Hitchcock was beginning to rise from his post as art director into the uncertain realm of direction. His ambition was obvious to those who watched him, and Alma observed him with the same sharp eye she brought to every project. His ideas were bold, sometimes impractical, sometimes brilliant. He would sketch storyboards with meticulous detail, imagining the camera as if it were a participant in the story rather than a mere recorder. Alma recognized in him a daring that was rare, but also a tendency to overreach. She understood that vision alone could collapse without discipline, and perhaps she sensed, though she would not have admitted it aloud, that her own discipline might one day steady his vision. The London studios of that era were restless places, filled with chatter about Hollywood and its vast productions. Britain sought to establish its own cinematic voice, yet resources were fewer, competition intense. In this climate, Alma's skill was invaluable, for efficiency mattered. A film that faltered in editing could cost a studio dearly. Again and again, she was the one who prevented such collapse, her meticulous notes guiding shoots, her corrections saving time. She was respected by colleagues, though often in that half-reluctant way, men of the age respected a woman whose intellect outpaced theirs. She bore such attitudes with dry wit, letting her work speak for itself. Her life in those years was not glamorous. There were no grand salaries, no celebrity. Days were long, spent in dim rooms under the constant flicker of moving images. Yet Alma did not complain. She seemed to draw satisfaction from the craft itself, from the quiet knowledge that she was shaping something lasting. In the evenings, she might walk home through the crowded streets of London, past shops closing their shutters, past children playing in alleys, the smell of bread or roasted chestnuts lingering in the air. The contrast between the ordinary life of the city and the extraordinary illusions of the screen must have been striking. Perhaps it pleased her, this balance between reality and artifice. It was during this period that Alma's reputation as a problem solver grew strongest. Scripts passed through her hands not merely to be checked, but to be improved. She would notice when motivation faltered, when structure sagged, when characters seemed unconvincing. Her comments were crisp, her tone practical. There was no vanity in her approach, only a devotion to clarity. To those who cared to see, it was obvious that Alma possessed the mind of a director, though opportunities for women in that role were scarce. Instead, she poured her talents into editing and writing, shaping films in ways that remain largely invisible to audiences but essential to their success. Hitchcock, meanwhile, grew bolder. He began to direct, first in small ways, then with greater authority. Alma watched as his ambition stretched across sets, as he experimented with framing, with unusual angles, with sequences designed to stir the nerves of viewers. She respected his daring, though she remained ready to note where logic faltered. In this unspoken dialogue, their partnership began to form. They were not yet a couple, not yet bound in marriage, but creatively their paths were drawing closer with each project. The laughter they shared in the canteen, the glances across cutting rooms, the conversations about story, they all built a foundation for what was to come. There is a quiet irony in the fact that Alma's influence expanded most precisely at the moment her visibility began to fade behind Hitchcock's growing reputation. As he moved into direction, his name appeared more prominently. His successes were celebrated. Alma's hand was often within those successes, her suggestions woven into scripts, her corrections guiding continuity, her instinct sharpening suspense. Yet her role was rarely acknowledged publicly. This was the way of the industry, where the spotlight fell on directors and actors, while editors and writers remained in shadow. Alma accepted it, perhaps with resignation, perhaps with relief. She had no desire for fame. But history, in its haste, has too often mistaken lack of visibility for lack of importance. In those mid-1920s years, Alma had become the unseen architect behind much of Britain's cinema. Her skill was whispered about among those who knew, her judgment sought after by those in difficulty. She was known for her wit, her refusal to flatter, her unwavering devotion to craft. And in the young Hitchcock, she had found someone whose imagination matched her own discipline, though neither yet realized the depth of their connection. The page of a script lay before her one evening, half torn by accident, the words broken mid-sentence. She smoothed it with her hand, reading the line again, rewriting it in her mind until it rang true. It was in such small acts that her influence lived, in corrections no one else noticed, but without which the story faltered. The torn page was mended, the reel carried on, and Alma's work continued, quiet yet profound, guiding the industry forward as surely as the trains her father once tended guided passengers to their destinations. And so the half-torn page lay upon her desk, smoothed but still bearing its faint scar, a symbol of the fragility of stories and of the hands that must mend them. Outside the studio, the night deepened, and the murmur of voices faded into quiet. Within the silence, Alma worked, her pencil moving, her eyes steady, preparing for the next day when once more her unseen hand would shape the world of film. The torn page, smoothed beneath Alma's steady hand, seemed to echo the fragility of beginnings, and it was from such fragments that the story of her own life began to mend into a new shape. For by the later half of the 1920s, the paths of Alma Reville and Alfred Hitchcock, once parallel and cautious, began to draw together in ways both personal and professional. Their work had already revealed a shared rhythm, an unspoken understanding of where vision met discipline, of how imagination required a steady frame. Now that understanding extended beyond the cutting rooms and script offices, weaving itself into the fabric of their days. In December of 1926, in the quiet parish of Brompton Oratory in London, they were married. There were no extravagant celebrations, no loud proclamations of destiny. Instead, it was a union marked by simplicity, by the recognition that their lives were already bound through shared labor, and that marriage was only another form of collaboration. For Alma, the marriage did not mean retreat from her craft, nor the exchange of one life for another. Rather, it deepened the intimacy of her partnership with Hitchcock, allowing her to inhabit both roles at once, wife and collaborator, companion and critic. It is often said that in public Alfred commanded attention while Alma lingered in shadow. Yet within their home and in the cutting rooms, she held a voice of remarkable clarity. He trusted her judgment above all others, and he often remarked, in later years, that Alma was his first audience. Before any script was approved, before any film was considered finished, it passed through her eyes. And in those eyes lay the quiet authority of a woman who had shaped film long before Hitchcock's fame took hold. Their marriage unfolded at a moment when cinema itself was undergoing profound transformation. The silent era, which had given Alma her training and her reputation, was yielding to the arrival of sound. Directors and producers alike were uncertain, some fearing that voices would diminish the purity of visual storytelling, others eager for the new possibilities. Alma saw both sides, but she also recognized that sound required a new kind of discipline. Words could weigh a scene down. Dialogue could break rhythm if not carefully placed. Here again, her instinct proved invaluable. She guided scripts to balance silence and speech, urging restraint where others might have indulged. In her hands, the marriage of sound and image was no clumsy collision, but a careful weaving. Hitchcock, meanwhile, seized upon sound as a tool for suspense. He imagined ways in which a whispered word, a pause, a sudden silence could heighten tension more than a dramatic gesture. Alma, sitting beside him in evenings, would listen as he explained his ideas, offering her own refinements. Their conversation stretched late into the night, the lamplight flickering upon pages of script, the air carrying the faint scent of tobacco smoke. One imagines the intimacy of those nights. Alfred leaning forward with excitement, Alma smiling faintly, pencil in hand, striking through a line of dialogue or suggesting a shift in timing. Marriage had not diminished their creative bond. It had intensified it, making their home itself a continuation of the studio. Yet this bond was not without its tensions. Alfred was ambitious, restless, sometimes consumed by his own visions. Alma was steadier, more private, sometimes weary of his eccentricities. But in their differences lay their strength. He could dream, and she could discipline. He could provoke, and she could refine. When disagreements came, they were not the battles of vanity, but the negotiations of two artisans seeking truth in story. Each recognized in the other not only a partner in life, but a mirror of their own incompleteness. Their marriage also introduced the challenge of balance. In 1928, their daughter, Patricia, was born, and Alma's life expanded to include motherhood alongside collaboration. She did not vanish into domesticity, as so many women of her time were expected to do. She continued to work, though at times quietly, often uncredited. She edited scripts, corrected continuity, advised on scenes, while also tending to her daughter and household. It was not an easy balance, but Alma bore it with the same patience she brought to her work. Perhaps she saw no distinction between shaping a film and shaping a home. Both required rhythm, both required attention to detail, both required sacrifice unseen by the world. In those early years of marriage, Alfred's career quickened. He directed The Lodger in 1927, a film that would later be recognized as the true beginning of his style. Alma's fingerprints were upon it as surely as his. She guided the story's flow, refined its suspense, adjusted its timing. The famous sequences of shadow and unease carried within them her instinct for restraint, her knowledge that terror lies not in what is shown, but in what is withheld. When audiences praised the film, they praised Alfred's name, but Alma's influence pulsed quietly beneath every frame. Marriage deepened her invisibility, even as it amplified her importance. To the world, Hitchcock's name rose higher with each success, while Alma's remained faint, mentioned rarely, often in passing. Yet within their home and their studio, her role was undeniable. Alfred himself admitted that without her, he could not work. She was not only his wife, but his conscience, his compass, the one who dared to tell him when he was wrong. In a world where few contradicted him, Alma did so with calm certainty, and he trusted her above all. It is tempting to imagine their evenings together, Patricia asleep in her room, the house quiet except for the turning of pages and the murmur of conversation. Alma would read aloud a line of dialogue, pause, and remark that it rang false. Alfred would frown, argue perhaps, then concede. In such exchanges their films were born, not only from his imagination but from her judgment. Their marriage was itself a cutting room, where rough material was trimmed, where rhythm was refined, where story was mended until it sang. And yet, for all her influence, Alma remained content to stand behind him. Was this humility, or was it the quiet knowledge that her power did not depend on recognition? Perhaps she knew that names fade quickly, that fame is fickle, while the work endures. Or perhaps she longed, secretly, for more acknowledgement, though she never asked. History offers no certainty. What we know is that Alma continued, day after day, to guide, to refine, to shape, her presence invisible yet essential. The bells of their wedding day had faded into the past, but their echo lingered still in the rhythm of their shared work. In public, Alfred carried the role of genius. In private, Alma steadied him, whispered corrections, guided his hand. Their union was not a romance of spectacle, but of substance, not fireworks, but steady flame. And it was this flame that would illuminate some of the greatest films of the century. The bells echoed faintly even years later, drifting across memory, lingering in the corners of rooms where scripts were read, where reels were cut, where their shared life unfolded. And as the last echo faded into silence, a microphone swung gently above an empty set, waiting for voices to enter this new era of sound, an era where Alma's guidance would again prove indispensable. The microphone swung gently above the empty set, suspended like a curious pendulum, waiting to catch voices that had never before been part of the moving pictures world. It trembled slightly in the draft of the studio air, a silent herald of transformation. For now sound was arriving, and with it came both exhilaration and dread. The directors who had once been masters of silent images now muttered anxiously, fearful that dialogue would drown their artistry, that actors accustomed to gesture would falter when asked to speak. Technicians hurried to master the new devices, their hands smudged with grease, their eyes tired from long nights of testing. The studios buzzed with uncertainty. And in the midst of this tremor stood Alma Reville, calm, observant, already considering how rhythm, dialogue, and silence must now weave together into something coherent. For Alma, the arrival of sound was not a catastrophe, but an expansion. She had always sensed that story lived not only in images, but also in the pauses between them, in the cadence of words, in the spaces left unsaid. Now cinema itself would have to learn what she already knew. Alfred Hitchcock, her husband, was restless with excitement. He saw in sound a new instrument of suspense. A whispered phrase could haunt, a sudden silence could unnerve, a burst of laughter could mask menace. Yet even he, daring though he was, looked to Alma for guidance. For where his imagination leapt, her precision anchored. She could hear when dialogue faltered, when words weighed a scene down, when pacing collapsed under too much chatter. In her ear lay the balance that would keep these new films from stumbling. Their evenings together became rehearsals of sound's possibilities. Scripts lay open upon their table, the lamplight falling across Alma's pencil marks. She would read a line aloud, pause, and suggest a cut. Alfred would protest, defend, then fall silent, recognizing her truth. It was Alma who reminded him that words must be rare, that silence itself was a voice. She urged restraint, an instinct that would mark Hitchcock's style throughout his career. The tension in his films often came not from what characters said, but from what they left unsaid, from the long pauses that unsettled the viewer's heart. This was Alma's influence, the hand that held the reins of his daring so that it might gallop in the right direction. The early sound years were filled with technical awkwardness. Actors sometimes froze before the looming microphone, their voices stiff and unnatural. Cameras, once free to glide, were now trapped in soundproof booths, their movement restricted. Many films of the late 1920s creaked under the weight of these new burdens. Yet Hitchcock and Alma approached the challenge with curiosity rather than fear. When Hitchcock directed Blackmail in 1929, one of Britain's first talking pictures, Alma's influence was palpable. She shaped dialogue with sharp economy, guided continuity through the clumsy machinery, and above all ensured that suspense remained intact. The film is remembered now for its daring use of sound, the repeated word knife echoing in the guilty woman's ears. Yet beneath that daring lay Alma's insistence on rhythm. Without her sense of timing, the sequence might have collapsed into excess. With it, the scene became unforgettable. To sit in a cinema in those years, hearing voices for the first time, must have been astonishing. Audiences gasped at the novelty, laughed with delight, sometimes cringed at the awkwardness. Alma watched these reactions closely, measuring not only what thrilled them, but what strained their patience. She carried these observations back to the cutting room, adjusting scripts and edits accordingly. She became a kind of translator, interpreting the new language of sound for directors who had not yet learned to speak it. Her advice was sought, her judgment respected, though again her name rarely appeared where the public might see it. At home, the balance of life shifted. Their daughter Patricia was still young, her laughter filling the rooms of their house, her needs reminding Alma that life was more than film. Yet Alma managed both worlds with patience. By day she was editor, script doctor, silent advisor. By evening she was mother, preparing meals, soothing a child to sleep. There must have been moments of exhaustion, yet Alma rarely complained. Perhaps she saw these roles as extensions of one another, both requiring attention to rhythm, both requiring patience. In her eyes, there was no conflict between shaping a film and shaping a family. Each demanded sacrifice, and she gave it quietly. The industry around her, however, was not quiet. Sound demanded new studios, new methods, new hierarchies. Britain struggled to keep pace with Hollywood, whose resources dwarfed those of London. Producers worried, directors experimented, actors trained their voices. Alma remained steady amid the tremor. She corrected errors, refined dialogue, advised on pacing. Alfred, ever ambitious, leaned more heavily on her counsel as his career quickened. In truth, their marriage had become a working partnership in the deepest sense. Films were discussed at the breakfast table, debated in the evenings, refined in whispers as their daughter slept. Their home was an extension of the cutting room, their marriage an unending conversation about story. There is something quietly moving in the image of Alma, seated with a script across her knees, a pencil in her hand, while Alfred speaks excitedly beside her. She listens, interrupts gently, suggests a change. He resists, then nods. The world would come to know him as the Master of Suspense. But in those moments he was a pupil before his first audience, the one whose judgment mattered most. Alma did not need credit. She knew her influence lay within the films themselves, each one bearing the subtle mark of her discipline. What is suspense, after all, if not the careful weaving of silence and sound, of seen and unseen, of said and unsaid? Alma had understood this long before microphones swung above sets. She had trained her eye in the silent years, where gesture carried weight, and she now trained her ear in the age of dialogue, where restraint mattered more than excess. She became the unseen teacher of a new grammar, her lessons absorbed by Hitchcock and carried into the films that would define his genius. As the 1930s approached, Alma's role only deepened. Hitchcock was no longer merely a promising young director. He was becoming a figure of prominence. Yet even as his fame grew, Alma's presence remained quiet, hidden in shadow. She was content, perhaps, to let his name carry the acclaim, for within their home and within their work, she knew the truth of her influence. Still, one cannot help but wonder, did she ever feel the sting of invisibility, the ache of knowing that her hand shaped masterpieces, yet her name was seldom spoken? The record is silent, and so we are left only with speculation. The microphone above the empty set swayed once more, as though to remind the world that cinema had changed forever. The actors would step forward, their voices caught, their words woven into story. And behind those words, behind the rhythm of their delivery, lay Alma's unseen hand, guiding, correcting, refining. The age of sound had begun, and Alma Reville had already ensured that it would not overwhelm the art of suspense, but rather deepen it. The microphone settled at last, still and waiting, its shadow long upon the floor. And beside it, a door creaked open into the editing room, where a single strip of film lay waiting to be held up to the light, uncut, its future unwritten, calling Alma to shape it into meaning. The strip of film glimmered faintly as Alma lifted it toward the lamp, the thin images captured upon its surface, trembling in the light. Uncut, unshaped, it was a fragment of possibility, awaiting her decision. She turned it slowly between her fingers, studying how the shadows fell across the characters' faces, how a gesture began but did not yet resolve, how the tension of the scene lived in the small gap between what was shown and what was hidden. This was the essence of her craft, the unseen authorship that no title card would ever proclaim. Alma Reville, shaping suspense, not with a loud gesture, but with the precision of a cut, with the patience of one who knew that fear lived most vividly in the unseen. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Hitchcock's name was beginning to gain weight in Britain. Critics noted his visual daring, his willingness to experiment with camera and angle, his taste for unease. Audiences remembered the thrill of the lodger, the restless tension of blackmail. But behind these emerging successes, Alma remained. She was no longer simply mending torn pages or trimming reels in silence. She was his closest collaborator, the one who guided his hand when his vision risked drowning in its own boldness. Her contributions were quiet but constant. When a sequence lingered too long, she cut. When dialogue weakened suspense, she rewrote. When continuity faltered, she repaired. Always she thought of the audience, of how their hearts would race or their breaths would stall, and always she insisted that less could achieve more. It was during these years that Hitchcock's reputation as the Master of Suspense began to take form. Yet it is worth asking, what is mastery but the marriage of imagination with discipline? Alfred dreamed of scenes that unsettled, but Alma knew how to make those dreams coherent. Suspense, after all, is not chaos, but control. The careful withholding of resolution, the measured stretching of silence, the exact timing of revelation. Alma, with her editor's ear and writer's hand, was the custodian of that control. She transformed Alfred's visions into something audiences could feel in their bones. The heartbeat of suspense was hers, as much as his. Consider a sequence from The Lodger, a mysterious figure ascending the stairs, the family below listening with growing dread. Hitchcock devised the shot of the ceiling rendered transparent, the lodger's steps visible through it, bold, inventive, but Alma understood that it was the rhythm of those steps, the cutting between faces and floor, that gave the scene its unease. She guided the tempo, ensuring that the suspense did not dissipate too soon. Without her adjustments, the brilliance of the concept might have faltered. With them, it lingered in memory. The same was true of Blackmail, Britain's first talking picture, where sound itself became a tool of tension. The repeated word knife, echoing in the ears of the guilty heroine, owed as much to Alma's sense of rhythm as to Alfred's daring. She recognized that repetition, used sparingly, could burrow into the audience's mind, making them complicit in the character's fear. What the world praised as innovation was, in truth, a dialogue between husband and wife, between visionary and editor, between dream and discipline. Yet Alma's authorship remained invisible. Reviews named Alfred. Posters carried his signature. Audiences spoke of his genius. Alma's role was confined to acknowledgments whispered among colleagues, to the trust Alfred himself confessed when he called her his indispensable partner. Perhaps she accepted this invisibility because she knew her power lay not in recognition, but in influence. Or perhaps she felt the quiet ache of erasure, an ache she never voiced aloud. History leaves us only fragments, and from those fragments we must imagine. What is certain is that Alma's touch shaped not only the rhythm of suspense, but also the texture of character. She possessed a keen sense of realism, honed from years of observing the smallest gestures in life. She insisted that characters behave believably, that their actions grow from recognizable motives rather than from contrived necessity. If a script faltered in logic, she corrected it. If dialogue rang false, she rewrote it. She was not merely polishing Alfred's visions, she was safeguarding the humanity within them. Suspense without truth, she knew, becomes hollow. It was her task to keep it alive. At home, their conversations were unending. The day's work spilled into evening, into meals, into late hours when the house was quiet and only the rustle of paper could be heard. Patricia, their young daughter, grew accustomed to scripts scattered upon tables, to the murmur of her parents debating lines and scenes. Alma's life was inseparable from film, her marriage indistinguishable from collaboration. She did not separate art from home. Both were spaces she shaped with the same patience and discipline. And Alfred, for all his eccentricities, knew her worth. He often said she was the only one who could tell him the truth. In the echo of that admission lies the measure of her importance. The cutting rooms of the early 1930s still smelled of celluloid and smoke, though now the added hum of sound equipment filled the air. Alma moved among them as she always had, steady, sharp-eyed, attentive. Technicians respected her, directors sought her advice, producers relied upon her efficiency. She was a fixture, though one few outside the studio world knew by name. But within those walls, her presence was felt in every decision, in every scene that flowed smoothly where it might have faltered. It is tempting to imagine Alma's thoughts in those years as she watched Alfred's reputation grow. Did she ever fear being left behind, her own craft eclipsed by his rising fame? Or did she see herself as inseparable from his success, content that his triumphs were also hers? Perhaps the truth lies between. She may have felt pride in shaping masterpieces, yet also the quiet sorrow of anonymity. To live in shadow is not always to live without pain, and yet Alma bore it, continuing her work with steadiness, refusing to demand what the industry was unwilling to grant. The open door of the cutting room revealed Alma seated at her table, scissors and notes at hand, the strip of film once more glimmering against the light. She studied it, then lowered it, then cut. The decision was made, the rhythm set, the story given its shape. Beyond the door, Alfred was preparing new projects, sketching storyboards, dreaming of thrillers yet unmade. The world would know his name, but within the reel lay Alma's touch, unseen yet indelible. The door creaked shut, leaving only a shadow across the floor, and from beneath that door spilled the faint outline of another shadow, this one belonging not to a figure seen, but to the suggestion of menace itself. The shadow of a half-open door in a story, a figure unseen, a fear not yet named. Alma's work lingered there, in the tension between what was shown and what remained hidden, guiding the audience into unease without their ever knowing whose hand had led them there. The shadow at the doorway lingered, stretched long and uncertain across the floor, as though it belonged to something or someone who might never fully appear. In this suspended image, we may glimpse not only the suspense Alma so carefully shaped on film, but also the rhythm of her own life in those years when her days became a balance of two worlds, one of domestic warmth and maternal care, the other of darkened cutting rooms and whispered corrections that guided the course of cinema. For by the early 1930s, Alma Reville was both mother and collaborator, tending to her daughter Patricia, while still shaping the films that would bear Alfred's name. Motherhood entered Alma's story in 1928 with Patricia's birth, a small child whose laughter softened the edges of their home. The presence of an infant altered the rhythm of Alma's days. Where once evenings had been wholly consumed by scripts and reels, now they were punctuated by the cries of a child, by the soothing hum of lullabies, by the tender labor of sleepless nights. Yet even here, Alma's sense of balance held firm. She did not surrender her work entirely, nor did she allow it to overshadow her duties as a mother. Instead, she wove the two together, moving with the same patience she had always shown, finding continuity not only on the screen, but in the texture of her own life. One may imagine her seated in the quiet of the nursery, Patricia drifting into slumber, while downstairs a script lay open upon the table awaiting her pencil. Alfred, restless with ambition, might be pacing the room, speaking of his latest idea, his voice rising with excitement. Alma, calm but firm, would listen, nod, and then gently point to a flaw in his plan. Even in the midst of maternal duties, she remained the first audience, the critic he trusted most. It was as though the walls of their home contained two parallel films, one of domestic tenderness, the other of suspense and vision, and Alma moved between them with quiet grace. Hitchcock's career during these years advanced quickly. Films such as The Man Who Knew Too Much and The 39 Steps brought him recognition beyond Britain, his name beginning to carry weight across the Atlantic. These were films remembered for their taut pacing, their ingenious sequences of peril and escape. Yet behind their polish lay Alma's steady hand. She refined dialogue, corrected continuity, trimmed excess. She advised him when a scene dragged, reminded him when logic faltered, urged restraint when his imagination threatened to overreach. Hitchcock himself later admitted that Alma was indispensable. Without her, he said, he could not work. And yet her contribution remained hidden, her name spoken quietly within the studio but rarely before the public. The paradox of her life grew sharper in these years. In her home, she was mother and wife, her presence essential yet largely invisible outside the family circle. In her work, she was editor, writer, advisor, again essential, again invisible. To live always as the unseen force is both a triumph and a sorrow. Alma bore it with dignity, though one cannot help but wonder if in quiet moments, when Patricia was asleep and Alfred had retired with his notes, she felt the ache of erasure. Did she long for her own name upon a poster, her own recognition in reviews? Or did she take comfort in knowing that her influence lived on in the films themselves, whether or not the world acknowledged it? History offers no clear answer. Her wit, however, remained undimmed. Friends and colleagues remembered her as sharp of tongue, capable of skewering pomposity with a single remark. She did not seek to dominate conversations, but when she spoke, her words carried weight. Alfred, with his fondness for performance and spectacle, may at times have been amused, at times chastened, by her quiet barbs. Within their marriage, her wit was a steady counterpoint to his eccentricities. She grounded him when his imagination ran wild. She reminded him of the human heart behind the mechanics of suspense. In this sense, her domestic and professional roles were not separate, but intertwined. Alma was always the one who steadied the household, whether that household was of family or of film. The decade also brought with it the weight of global uncertainty. The 1930s were shadowed by economic depression, by the rise of tensions in Europe, by the knowledge that another war might yet come. Against this backdrop, cinema offered both escape and reflection. Audiences filled theaters to watch thrillers that mirrored their anxieties, to feel suspense safely contained within the screen. Alma and Alfred were crafting films that spoke to this need, though perhaps without fully realizing how deeply they echoed the unease of the age. Alma, sensitive to the subtleties of audience reaction, must have felt the undercurrent of fear and desire that ran through the crowds. Her refinements ensured that the films met these unspoken needs, balancing fear with release, suspense with resolution. At home, Patricia grew, her presence a reminder that life was more than film reels and scripts. Alma guided her with the same quiet discipline she brought to her work, instilling in her a sense of order, of patience, of humor. The contrast between Hitchcock's public image and Alma's private steadiness was striking. He was flamboyant, cultivating his reputation as master of macabre wit. She was restrained, content to remain unseen. Yet their daughter knew both sides, growing up in a household where laughter mingled with tension, where meals might turn into discussions of murder plots, where bedtime stories might carry the rhythm of suspense. It is moving to imagine Alma in those evenings, the house finally quiet, sitting alone with a reel of film or a marked script, the lamp casting her shadow upon the wall. In those moments she was neither solely mother nor solely collaborator, but wholly herself. A woman whose mind shaped stories, whose discipline guided art, whose presence steadied both family and film. And yet outside that quiet room, her name remained faint, her work unacknowledged by the wider world. Such is the fate of many who labor in shadows. The unresolved ringing of a telephone often cut into such quiet. Producers called with questions, colleagues sought advice, Hitchcock himself summoned her opinion. The sound broke the calm of domesticity, pulling her once more into the restless demands of cinema. And Alma, with her patient steadiness, answered, setting aside her own rest to serve the story once again. Her life was a constant negotiation between the personal and the professional, between the tenderness of home and the suspense of film. One night, perhaps, the telephone rang just as she finished a lullaby for Patricia. The child's breathing steadied into sleep, the song left unfinished upon Alma's lips. Downstairs, the telephone insisted, its shrill cry demanding attention. Alma rose, descended, and answered, carrying once more the dual burdens she bore so patiently. The lullaby hung in the air, unresolved, its melody fading into silence even as Alma's voice, calm and precise, addressed the needs of another film. The lullaby lingered, broken mid-note by the shrill cry of the telephone, and its melody seemed to dissolve into the restless hum of change that was beginning to shape the Hitchcock's lives. The call was not merely the demand of another late-night correction or the anxious voice of a producer. It was the herald of a greater summons, one that would carry Alma, Alfred, and their daughter far from the familiar streets of London to the bright, disorienting expanse of Hollywood. For by the late 1930s, Hitchcock's reputation in Britain had grown so steadily that the American studios, with their vast resources and their hunger for talent, sought to claim him. And Alma, as always, would follow, not as a shadow trailing his fame, but as the steady presence that softened the shock of exile and preserved the coherence of his art. The invitation came with both promise and peril. Hollywood was no ordinary city. It was an empire of images, a place where glamour and excess coexisted with ruthless competition. Its studios dwarfed those of London. Its budgets were enormous, its reach global. For Alfred, restless with ambition, the offer was irresistible. For Alma, more cautious, it carried unease. To leave behind the familiar rhythms of British life, to uproot their daughter, to step into a culture loud and unfamiliar, these were not small matters. Yet Alma understood that his path demanded it, and so she steadied herself as she had always done, preparing to balance the dislocation with patience. The voyage itself was a crossing of thresholds. One imagines Alma upon the deck of the ship, the cold wind off the Atlantic tugging at her coat, the vast ocean stretching into emptiness. Patricia, still a child, perhaps clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide with both fear and excitement. Alfred, pacing the deck, spoke already of the films he wished to make, of the opportunities awaiting them. Alma listened, her gaze steady upon the horizon, her thoughts balancing both hope and apprehension. She knew that in America, her role would be both more necessary and more hidden, for the scale of Hollywood productions would demand her guidance even as the machinery of publicity ensured her invisibility. Their arrival in California must have been overwhelming. The sunlight there was unlike the diffused glow of England. It was harsher, brighter, relentless. The air smelled not of coal smoke and rain, but of orange blossoms and dust. The city stretched wide and flat, palm trees swaying in the wind, billboards proclaiming names larger than life. To Alfred, this was a stage waiting to be claimed. To Alma, it was a landscape to be endured, softened only by the constancy of her work. She did not lose herself in glamour. She kept her focus upon scripts, upon structure, upon the quiet labor of refinement. Their first major project in America was Rebecca, 1940, produced under the eye of David O. Selznick, a man known for his insistence upon control. The collaboration was fraught, for Hitchcock's desire for independence clashed with Selznick's demand for detail. In this tense space, Alma's influence was vital. She smoothed tensions where she could, advised Alfred with clarity, and shaped the script and continuity to preserve coherence amid the chaos. Rebecca went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, securing Hitchcock's place in Hollywood. Yet within its structure lay Alma's invisible touch, her insistence on rhythm, her guidance on dialogue, her corrections to pacing. The famous image of Manderley consumed by flames, the echo of memory within its halls, carried not only Hitchcock's vision, but Alma's refinement. Hollywood life was not easy for her. The culture was louder, the expectations harsher, the pace more demanding. Alfred was consumed by his work, his eccentricities sharpened by the pressures of fame. Alma, far from home, bore the burden of steadiness once more. She tended to Patricia, maintained the household, and continued to labor behind the films. Friends who knew them remarked on her wit, her calm presence, her ability to ground Alfred when his anxieties threatened to overwhelm him. In a world of spectacle, she remained private, content to move in silence. Yet that silence was not absence. It was the stillness of the axis upon which everything turned. Imagine her at a Hollywood dinner party, the room filled with producers, actors, and directors, laughter loud, glasses clinking. Alfred, ever fond of performance, might hold court with his macabre humor, drawing attention with ease. Alma, seated quietly nearby, would offer a remark so precise, so incisive, that the table would pause, laugh, or fall silent. She did not need to compete with spectacle. Her authority lay in her subtlety. And when the evening ended, when the lights of the city dimmed and the household was still, she would return once more to the scripts, to the words that demanded her correction, to the rhythm that only she could ensure. Hollywood was a place of exile for many Europeans fleeing turmoil in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and Alma must have felt kinship with others who carried the ache of displacement. England remained in her heart, the fog, the bells, the narrow streets of her youth, but she adapted as she always had, quietly, without complaint. Perhaps she found solace in the garden of their home, in the small domestic rituals that remained unchanged across continents. Or perhaps her solace lay entirely in her work, in the knowledge that her hand continued to shape films that reached audiences far beyond any single city. The 1940s brought more successes: Suspicion, Shadow of a Doubt, Notorious. Each bore Hitchcock's name, each carried Alma's imprint. She advised on casting, on dialogue, on editing. She remained the first audience, the one who could say with calm certainty whether a scene worked or faltered. Alfred depended on her, perhaps more than he ever admitted in public. Within their home, her counsel was law. Outside it, her name was rarely spoken. Such was the paradox of her existence, an existence she bore with dignity. And always, in the midst of fame and exile, she kept balance. Patricia grew, the household remained steady, the films advanced. Alma's life was a constant weaving of threads: family, work, exile, artistry, each thread held firmly, none allowed to unravel. She was the quiet seamstress of their world, stitching fragments into coherence. The Californian sunset burned each evening with colors too vivid, the horizon glowing orange and crimson, the palms etched black against the sky. Alma, watching from the porch, might have thought of the softer twilight of England, of the gray skies of Nottingham, of the lamps glowing in London streets. Yet she did not speak of longing. She turned instead to the task at hand, steadying Alfred, guiding Patricia, shaping films. The sunset remained unfinished in its descent, a reminder that no place is entirely home, that exile is both loss and renewal. And so the glow of that Californian evening lingers still, casting long shadows across their garden, unfinished, unresolved, leading us into the next stage of Alma's journey, where the glow of fire upon Manderley's walls gave way to the lingering scent of ash, and her unseen hand continued to shape the rhythm of stories in a land that was never fully her own. The Californian sunset lingered, its fiery glow still staining the horizon, and from within its brilliance seemed to rise the imagined ash of Manderley, that great house consumed by flame at the close of Rebecca. The scent of burning paper and timber drifted across memory, haunting the air long after the screen had gone dark. For Alma, who had watched the story unfold from its earliest drafts to its final cut, those flames carried not only the end of a tale, but also the affirmation of her place in Hollywood's uncertain world. Rebecca was their first major American work, and though Alfred's name blazed on posters, Alma's quiet hand had guided it through turmoil and discord, ensuring its coherence and its power. The production was fraught. David O. Selznick, the producer, was notorious for his exacting control. He battled with Hitchcock over details, demanding loyalty to Daphne du Maurier's novel, resisting Alfred's instinct to simplify or to impose his own style. The atmosphere on set and in the editing rooms grew tense, voices raised, tempers stretched thin. In such moments, Alma's presence was essential. She calmed Alfred when his frustrations boiled, she soothed disagreements where she could, and above all, she kept her focus upon the story itself. While men quarreled over credit and control, Alma worked quietly, ensuring that the film's rhythm did not falter. She paid special attention to the relationship between the nameless heroine and the spectral memory of Rebecca, whose absence dominates every frame. Alma understood that suspense here was not built upon sudden violence, but upon suggestion, upon silence, upon the unseen. The audience must feel Rebecca's presence, even though she never appears. It was Alma who urged restraint, who reminded Alfred that too much explanation would weaken the haunting. She sharpened dialogue, pruned scenes, preserved the ambiguity, and it was this ambiguity, this atmosphere of dread and memory, that gave Rebecca its enduring power. The result was a triumph. Rebecca won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1940, the only Hitchcock film ever to do so. Audiences were enthralled by its gothic atmosphere, its lingering sense of menace, its careful suspense. Critics praised Hitchcock, lauding his mastery, yet behind the accolades, Alma remained invisible. Her name was absent from speeches, her role barely mentioned, and yet she was there, within every frame, in the measured pacing of dialogue, in the silence that hung over Manderley's halls, in the final image of fire consuming the past. The triumph was hers as much as Alfred's, though history did not say so. At home, Alma bore the same patience she always had. Hollywood's excesses swirled around them, parties, contracts, interviews, yet she remained steady, preferring the quiet of family life and the order of work. Patricia grew, attending school, adapting to this new world. Alfred's fame expanded, his eccentric persona becoming a subject of fascination. Alma moved beside him, not in front, content to remain unseen, but within the circle of colleagues who knew her influence was acknowledged. They understood that Hitchcock listened to no one as he listened to Alma, that she was his true compass. The 1940s brought other projects, each shaped by her unseen hand. In Suspicion, she pressed for clarity in the story's resolution, concerned that ambiguity might confuse rather than disturb. In Shadow of a Doubt, she guided the rhythm of domestic life against which menace unfolded, ensuring that the ordinariness of family made the darkness more chilling. In Notorious, she refined dialogue, balancing romance with espionage, ensuring that suspense never dissolved into melodrama. Again and again, her influence preserved coherence. Her instinct protected truth. Alfred's genius dazzled, but Alma's discipline steadied it. Still, one cannot help but wonder, did she feel the pang of invisibility when Rebecca triumphed without her name upon the award? Did she sit in the quiet of her home, reflecting on the work she had done, knowing the world would never speak of it? Perhaps she felt sorrow. Perhaps she took pride in silence. The truth remains veiled, as she herself preferred. She was not one to demand recognition, yet absence is its own burden. The ash of Manderley carried both triumph and erasure, both glory and silence. Even as her work shaped Hitchcock's films, Alma bore the weight of exile. The bright Californian sun still seemed foreign, the culture still strange. She missed England, its gray skies, its rhythms, yet she endured, finding solace in her craft, in the laughter of her daughter, in the steady companionship of Alfred despite his eccentricities. She adapted as she always had, quietly, without complaint, without. In Hollywood's restless noise, Alma remained a figure of calm, her wit intact, her patience unbroken. The war years added their own weight. Europe was engulfed, friends and colleagues displaced, the news filled with destruction. Alma, though far away, felt the ache of distance. Alfred, too, followed the reports, their conversations at home tinged with anxiety. Yet even in such times, the work continued. Films were written, scenes debated, suspense crafted. For cinema, even amid war, remained both escape and reflection. Alma, guiding scripts, knew that audiences needed both reassurance and unease, both fear and release. Her instinct tuned itself to the pulse of a troubled world. There is a certain poignancy in the image of Alma sitting in a darkened theater at the premiere of Rebecca, the applause rising, the names upon the screen drawing acclaim, while she herself remained unseen. Did she smile faintly, knowing that the rhythm of the film was hers, that the haunting presence of Rebecca lived because she preserved its ambiguity? Or did she simply turn to Alfred, sharing the triumph quietly, content that their collaboration had borne fruit? Perhaps both, for Alma's life was always a mingling of pride and invisibility, of influence and silence. The flames of Manderley burned on the screen, consuming the great house, the past collapsing into ash. Alma, seated in the audience, might have smelled again the faint scent of burning paper, a reminder of how fragile all structures are, how quickly they can vanish. Yet she also knew that in film nothing is ever truly destroyed, that memory endures, that stories linger. Her own life was proof of this. Though her name faded, her influence endured, written into the very fabric of cinema. The scent of ash lingered as the credits rolled, fading into silence as the screen darkened. And in that silence, as the audience rose, there remained the steady presence of Alma Reville, invisible yet essential, the unseen hand behind the triumph. Outside, the night air of California was warm, the stars sharp against the sky. The ash of Manderley dissolved into the breeze, carrying Alma forward into the next chapter of her life, where typewriter keys would strike again, their rhythm unbroken, their clatter echoing late into the night. The typewriter keys struck late into the night, their metallic rhythm filling the quiet rooms long after the house had settled into silence. Alma sat close by, pencil in hand, reading over lines as they appeared, her eyes sharp even as the hours stretched on. Outside, the war had engulfed Europe, shadows deepening across the familiar cities of her youth. From across the ocean came news of bombings, rationing, lives uprooted. Alma, though safe in California, carried the weight of distance in her heart. The typewriter's clatter became in some way a shield against helplessness, for work remained the one certainty, the one structure she could preserve amid the collapse of others. And so, through those turbulent war years, she gave herself more deeply than ever to her craft, preserving clarity when scripts faltered, guiding stories when they threatened to lose coherence, ensuring that Hitchcock's films did not drift into confusion, but carried the taut line of suspense that audiences needed. Hollywood itself was restless. War films, propaganda, escapist romances, all were demanded at once. Studios pressed forward with urgency, sometimes sacrificing refinement in their haste. Scripts arrived in half-finished forms, plots tangled, motivations unclear. Alfred, quick to seize upon striking images, sometimes embraced stories before they were fully coherent. Alma, seated at her desk, became the quiet guardian who prevented collapse. She trimmed dialogue that meandered. She marked holes in logic. She reminded Alfred that even in fantasy, the audience demanded truth. It was a role she had always played, but now it was more vital than ever. In wartime, when fear and loss filled the world, suspense could not be careless. It had to be precise, shaped carefully, so that audiences would trust the story enough to surrender to it. Suspicion in 1941 revealed this balance. The story of a young wife who fears her charming husband may be plotting her murder required delicacy. Too much certainty and the suspense vanished. Too much ambiguity and the audience felt betrayed. Alma pressed for clarity, ensuring that tension remained without dissolving into confusion. Though studio pressures forced compromises, her influence steadied the structure. She saw that suspense must be anchored in the believable, that audiences must feel both fear and recognition in equal measure. In Shadow of a Doubt, 1943, often called Hitchcock's personal favorite, Alma's touch was again decisive. The story unfolded in the quiet streets of a small American town, where a beloved uncle is revealed as a murderer. Alma shaped the rhythms of domestic life that made the intrusion of menace so chilling. She reminded Alfred that dread is most potent when set against the ordinary, the sound of children laughing, the warmth of family meals, the rituals of daily life. By refining dialogue and tightening pacing, she ensured that the darkness crept in, slowly, believably, until it lay inescapably across the characters. Without her adjustments, the story might have tipped into melodrama. With her guidance, it became one of Hitchcock's most profound meditations on evil within the everyday. The typewriter keys clattered on, their rhythm punctuated by pauses when Alma marked a page with her pencil, rewriting a phrase, smoothing a transition. She never sought to impose her own authorship, but she knew instinctively when a story strayed. Her corrections were not flamboyant, not radical. They were precise, surgical, invisible to the eye yet essential to the whole. If the final film flowed smoothly, audiences never questioned it. They did not know that Alma had been there in the night, listening, trimming, shaping, keeping coherence alive when it threatened to vanish. At home, the weight of war pressed heavily. Letters arrived from friends in England, carrying news of bombed neighborhoods, of rationing, of fear. Alma read them quietly, her face steady, her heart no doubt heavy with longing. She missed the gray skies, the bells of London, the rhythm of the streets she had once walked, yet she bore her exile with the same patience she had always shown. She poured her steadiness into her family, guiding Patricia through school, supporting Alfred through his restlessness, ensuring that the household remained calm even as the world beyond was fractured. Alfred, consumed by his public persona and his ambitions, relied on her more than ever. He could dream of elaborate set pieces, of daring camera movements, of sudden shocks, but it was Alma who tethered these dreams to the spine of story. She never scolded, never mocked, but her quiet verdicts carried more weight than any critic's. When she said a scene failed, Alfred listened. When she urged restraint, he obeyed. Her discipline became the invisible frame around his imagination, the quiet architecture that held his visions upright. And yet, her name remained small. Studio memos, production notes, contracts. They rarely listed her contributions. At best, she appeared in credits as a writer or assistant. More often, she was absent altogether. This invisibility was the cost of her position, the price of collaboration in an industry that prized singular names over shared labor. Alma accepted it outwardly, but one imagines she must have felt, at least at times, the ache of erasure. To see films she had shaped praised as masterpieces, to hear Alfred lauded as genius, and yet to remain unnamed. Was this not its own form of silence? And still she continued, not for recognition, but for the work itself, for the craft she loved, for the family she sustained. Her discipline was matched by her wit. Friends who visited recalled Alma's sharp remarks, her ability to puncture pretension with a single comment. In Hollywood's world of vanity, her humor was a quiet rebellion. She could laugh at the excesses of producers, tease Alfred's obsessions, remind all around her that life was larger than cinema. In these moments, her individuality shone, not as collaborator or wife, but as Alma herself, wry, intelligent, unshaken. Through the war years, the typewriter continued, the scissors clicked, the reels turned. Films were born, each one carrying Alma's unseen influence. She never demanded credit, never insisted upon applause. She labored in the shadows, confident that her corrections mattered, that her precision preserved truth. And so the films endured, not as chaotic dreams, but as coherent stories that audiences could believe. The war at last drew toward its end, the world shifting once more. But Alma's work did not cease. The typewriter still struck late into the night, the keys echoing in the quiet, until at last one stuck mid-sentence, its clatter cut short. The page beneath bore half a word, unfinished, waiting for her hand to complete it. And in that silence, as the key remained pressed, the story paused, unresolved, leading us onward into another chapter, where suspense itself would be born not from bombs or shadows, but from the frailty of human hearts. The typewriter key remained stuck mid-sentence, its arm pressing against the page as though unwilling to release its grip on the unfinished word. Alma leaned forward, freeing it with the practiced patience of someone long accustomed to halting machinery, and in that small act we may glimpse the larger work of her life, setting stories back into motion when they threatened to stall, smoothing the rhythm of thought when it risked breaking apart. For as the war years gave way to their uneasy aftermath, Hitchcock's films began to explore not only suspense in the outward sense, chases, escapes, revelations, but suspense within the mind itself, the shadowed corners of ordinary hearts. And here Alma's influence deepened, for she understood that the most unsettling terror was not what a man did in darkness, but what he carried secretly in daylight. The unfinished key found its echo in shadow of a doubt, that meditation on menace hidden in a family home. Alma had already guided its rhythms, ensuring that the ordinariness of the Newton household made the intrusion of Uncle Charlie all the more devastating. Yet the lesson of that film, the tension between affection and fear, between trust and betrayal, lingered in the projects that followed. Alma recognized that audiences were prepared now for stories less about external villains than about the cracks within familiar bonds. The world, scarred by war, knew too well that danger might come not from distant enemies, but from neighbors, even loved ones. When Hitchcock turned to Notorious in 1946, a tale of espionage set against the aftermath of conflict, Alma's hand again was present. The film is remembered for its elegance, for the famous kiss between Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, for the champagne-filled suspense of poison bottles. Yet beneath its glamour lies a psychological depth Alma helped preserve. She ensured that Alicia's torn loyalties felt real, that her conflicted emotions did not collapse into melodrama. She guided dialogue to avoid excess, insisted that pauses speak as loudly as words, shaped the script until it balanced romance with dread. The suspense of Notorious is not only in whether the poison will be discovered, but in whether love itself can withstand mistrust. Such subtleties bore Alma's mark. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw Hitchcock exploring more fully this terrain of inner darkness. Alma, with her sharp instinct for character, was essential in shaping these explorations. Suspense, she reminded him, must rest upon truth. A character's fear must arise from believable motives. A hesitation must echo something the audience has themselves felt. Without this grounding, no camera trick or elaborate set piece could hold. She corrected scenes that strained credulity, pruned dialogue that rang false, reminded Alfred again and again that the greatest shocks are born from recognition. At home, Alma's life continued its double rhythm. Patricia was growing into young adulthood, her presence no longer the fragile demand of infancy, but the curiosity of youth. Alfred, ever restless, busied himself with new ideas, new contracts, new experiments. Alma remained at the center, quiet but steady, ensuring that their household held together even as their work demanded more. Friends recalled her wit during these years, still sharp, still precise. At gatherings, she spoke sparingly, but her remarks, like her edits, cut clean to the heart of things. The world around them shifted too. Hollywood entered its golden age, studios swelling with glamour and pressure. Stars commanded headlines, directors cultivated reputations, gossip swirled in papers. Alma moved through this noise with her usual composure, uninterested in spectacle, devoted to substance. She had no taste for gossip columns, no desire for limelight. Her work and her family were enough. Yet her invisibility grew heavier, for Alfred's fame expanded with each film, while her name remained hidden. If she felt resentment, she rarely showed it. Perhaps her silence was strength, perhaps it was resignation. Either way, the work endured, and within it, her influence lived on. The typewriter key that once stuck mid-sentence seemed to symbolize the fragility of story itself. How easily it might falter, how swiftly coherence might be lost. Alma knew this better than anyone. She was the one who freed the mechanism, who kept the rhythm alive. In film after film of those years, her corrections preserved flow, her instincts deepened character, her restraint gave weight to suspense. When Alfred's imagination reached toward spectacle, Alma reminded him of the human heart. Without that heart, she insisted, suspense was hollow. With it, the simplest gesture, a glance, a pause, a half-spoken word, could terrify. Imagine her in the cutting room once more, reels spooling, images flickering against the wall. She leans forward, noting a hesitation that lingers too long, a look that should arrive a second sooner. She marks the change, trims the frame, resets the rhythm. Outside the studio, the world clamors with distractions. Inside, Alma listens only to the heartbeat of the film. It is her gift, her vocation, her unseen authorship. And always there is the question, did she know how essential she was? Did she recognize that Hitchcock's genius was inseparable from her guidance, that his triumphs bore her signature as surely as his own? Perhaps she did, and found satisfaction in it. Or perhaps she did not think in such terms, content to labor as she always had, for the work itself, for the coherence of story. We cannot know. What we do know is that her presence shaped every frame, even when her name did not. The typewriter rested at last, the stuck key released, the page filled with words made coherent by Alma's eye. She set it aside, another script refined, another story steadied. In the silence that followed, a faint sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen. Patricia's voice mingled with Alfred's. Alma rose, joining them, her presence quiet but central, as it was in every part of their lives. And in the background, faint but insistent, there lingered a child's laughter that seemed, to Alma, to carry with it both innocence and menace, both joy and unease. It was the perfect sound to lead her once more into the heart of suspense. The faint mingling of laughter from kitchen and parlor lingered in the air, light and ordinary. Yet beneath it, Alma always sensed an undertone, the fragile edge where happiness might turn to unease. For she knew that even in the comfort of home, suspense had its place, not in violence or shock, but in the unpredictable rhythm of living with a man whose mind was ceaselessly occupied by strange imaginings. Alfred's eccentricities filled their household as surely as the smell of suppers, cooking, or the sound of clocks ticking in the hallway. He told dark jokes at the dinner table, teased Patricia with tales of danger, spoke of plots and crimes as though they were casual topics of conversation. Alma, steady as always, kept balance. She did not scold or silence him, but she ensured that beneath his theatrics, their life retained order. Meals were served, routines held, the household remained intact. For Alfred thrived in the world of performance. He delighted in unsettling guests with macabre humor, offering meals dyed in unnatural colors, or describing murder methods with unnerving precision. It was his way of keeping the atmosphere charged, of reminding all who knew him that he was not merely a man, but a creator of suspense, even in daily life. Alma did not indulge in such games. She smiled faintly, sometimes replied with a dry remark, sometimes allowed his performance to pass unanswered. She was the grounding presence, the still point around which his restlessness spun. Without her, the eccentricities might have tipped into chaos. With her, they remained contained within the safe bounds of family ritual. Patricia, growing into young womanhood, knew both sides of her parents. The father, flamboyant, teasing, theatrical. The mother, quiet, steady, sharp-eyed. It was Alma who ensured her childhood remained ordinary enough, shielding her from the extremes of Alfred's world. She oversaw schooling, managed the household, maintained friendships. Her role was not dramatic, but essential. She was the seamstress of continuity, stitching together the fragments of their domestic life with the same care she gave to reels of film. And yet Alma's wit never dulled. Guests who came to dine often remembered her more than Alfred. Though he commanded attention with jokes, she delivered remarks that cut more deeply. One well-placed comment from Alma could silence a boast, deflate pretension, or provoke laughter sharper than Alfred's theatrics. Those who knew them both understood that hers was not the lesser voice. It was quieter, yes, but no less decisive. Even Alfred, who loved to dominate, acknowledged this. He admitted often that Alma's judgment was final, that she alone could tell him the truth. At the heart of their domestic rhythm lay meals shared around the table. Alfred, famously obsessed with food, often indulged in ritual and excess, while Alma ensured the family was fed with steadiness and care. Their table was a place of conversation, of debate over scripts, of laughter mingled with shadows. It was Alma who guided the flow, ensuring that humor did not become cruelty, that eccentricity did not overwhelm. In this way, the dinner table became another kind of cutting room, where Alma preserved rhythm, balance, and coherence. Her work, though often unseen, extended into every corner of their life. She checked Alfred's health, monitored his moods, managed the demands of his fame. She corrected not only scripts, but social missteps, smoothing relationships strained by Alfred's bluntness or neglect. Her patience was not passive, it was active, a constant labor of care and correction. In many ways, she performed the same role in their household as she did in his films, ensuring that vision did not collapse into chaos, that the story of their family remained whole. Yet Alma was not without her own needs. She enjoyed quiet gatherings with friends, valued conversation free from spectacle, relished time in gardens, or simply reading in silence. These were her sanctuaries, her ways of renewing strength. For living beside a man so consuming, so restless, required balance. She found it not in loud escapes, but in quiet spaces where her own presence could breathe. The world beyond their home pressed forward too. The post-war years reshaped Hollywood, studios shifting, stars rising and fading. Alfred's career climbed higher, his reputation secure, his persona cultivated with care. Alma remained beside him, shaping films, guiding scripts, preserving order. Yet she also carried the quieter burden of invisibility. To the world, she was Hitchcock's wife, an elegant figure at his side, rarely mentioned in accounts of genius. Within the home and studio, she was indispensable. But the world beyond saw only his shadow, not hers. Did this trouble her? Perhaps in moments of solitude, she felt the weight of erasure. Perhaps she wondered what might have been had she chosen a different path, had her own name been given prominence. Or perhaps she accepted it, finding satisfaction in the truth known within their circle, that Alfred depended upon her utterly, that she was the axis of both his art and his life. Alma rarely spoke of such matters, preferring action to declaration. Her silence leaves us only with speculation. There is something quietly profound in imagining Alma at the dinner table, Alfred spinning some tale of crime to amuse guests, Patricia listening with mixed fascination and weariness, the room alive with laughter and unease. Alma, seated calmly, delivers a remark at just the right moment, turning the conversation back towards steadiness, grounding the atmosphere once more. This was her role always, not to silence the eccentricities, but to balance them, to ensure they did not overwhelm the whole. She was the measure of proportion, the guardian of coherence, whether in film or family. The dinner table remained a constant presence, its chairs set, its rituals repeated, the food served, the conversations unfolding. And yet, on one evening, as the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, a chair remained slightly pulled away, unoccupied, its absence unspoken, but felt. It was the image of impermanence, of the quiet gaps that appear even in the most carefully balanced households. Alma's eyes lingered upon it, noting its disruption, sensing perhaps that every story carries its own shadow of loss, its own reminder that continuity is never perfect. The chair stood as a silent question, unresolved, awaiting its place in the story yet to come. The chair slightly pulled away from the dinner table remained, an absence small yet strangely insistent, like a note out of place in a melody that otherwise flowed without fault. Alma's eyes lingered upon it, not with alarm, but with the same quiet awareness she brought to every disruption of rhythm. She would not move it at once. She allowed it to stand as a reminder that even the most carefully ordered household bore its moments of imperfection, just as even the most polished film contained its flaws until her hand smoothed them. That chair, unoccupied and unresolved, became a symbol of her role during the next great chapter of their lives, when Hitchcock's genius reached its fullest bloom in the films of the 1950s, and when Alma's unseen presence corrected what was misaligned, preserving harmony while remaining herself in shadow. The decade opened with a string of triumphs that would cement Hitchcock's legacy: Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, The Man Who Knew Too Much in its American remake, Vertigo, North by Northwest. Each of these films dazzled audiences with their daring, their precision, their capacity to turn ordinary spaces into landscapes of suspense. Yet behind their brilliance lay the quiet labor of Alma. She was there at the start of each project, script in hand, marking pages, questioning logic, suggesting refinements. She was there in the middle, watching rushes, correcting continuity, urging restraint when Alfred's imagination threatened to overwhelm. And she was there at the end, sitting beside him in the cutting rooms or in the quiet of their home, noting the smallest lapse, ensuring that the whole remained unbroken. Rear Window in 1954 stands as perhaps the purest embodiment of Hitchcock's fascination with watching, with the tension between seeing and being seen. James Stewart's immobilized photographer observes his neighbors through their windows, piecing together a possible crime. The suspense lies not in action, but in the act of looking itself. Alma understood the danger of such a story. It might lapse into monotony, into repetition, into voyeurism without drama. She guided the script, urging variation in rhythm, ensuring that each window revealed not merely another scene, but another layer of story. She recognized that the audience's patience was a fragile thread, and she kept it taut with her instinct for timing. The famous climax, when Menace at last enters Stewart's room, carried its force because Alma preserved the slow build without letting it collapse. In To Catch a Thief, released the following year, suspense mingled with glamour. Cary Grant and Grace Kelly moved through the sunlit Riviera, their banter as sharp as their silences. Alma's influence here was subtle but essential. She refined dialogue so that wit sparkled without becoming brittle. She adjusted pacing so that romance did not smother suspense. She understood that in a story of elegance and charm, restraint mattered more than flourish. The film's lightness of touch, its balance of tension and delight, bore her signature as surely as Alfred's. But it was Vertigo in 1958 that carried Hitchcock into depths of psychological darkness, unlike anything before. And here, Alma's presence was perhaps most crucial. The story of obsession, illusion, and despair was fraught with peril. Its complexity risked incoherence. Its darkness risked alienating audiences. Alfred, enthralled by the theme, pressed forward, but Alma urged caution. She trimmed dialogue that explained too much. She guided scenes so that ambiguity remained haunting rather than confusing. She recognized that the audience must feel the pull of Scotty's obsession without losing empathy, that the mystery must hold even as its solution approached. In the end, Vertigo bewildered some in its time, but later came to be recognized as one of cinema's greatest achievements. Beneath its dreamlike flow lay Alma's discipline, the invisible architecture without which it might have collapsed. During these years, Alfred's fame grew to its height. He appeared on magazine covers, cultivated his persona as the wry master of suspense, hosted his own television series, with macabre introductions that made him a household figure. The world celebrated him, laughed at his dark humor, admired his genius. Alma, by contrast, remained largely invisible to the public. She attended premieres, sat beside him at dinners, but her name was rarely spoken. Within their circle, however, her authority was undisputed. Colleagues knew that Hitchcock listened to no one as he listened to her, that a script rejected by Alma would not be pursued, that her notes in the margins could shape a film's course. She was the invisible editor not only of his films, but of his career. At home, the balance of family life continued. Patricia, now grown, pursued her own acting career for a time, appearing even in her father's films. Alma watched with quiet pride, guiding gently, never pushing. Her role as mother remained steady, her role as collaborator unbroken. The dinner table still served as a place where stories were debated, where Alfred's eccentric humor mingled with Alma's sharp corrections. That slightly pulled-away chair might belong to a guest, or it might stand simply as a reminder that presence and absence coexist always, that perfection is never complete. Alma, ever observant, carried this truth with her. Hollywood in the 1950s shimmered with glamour, yet Alma never sought it. She wore elegance with simplicity, spoke sparingly at parties, preferred quiet evenings at home. She was content to let Alfred play the role of celebrity while she remained the quiet conscience. Her wit, when she chose to reveal it, startled even the most seasoned guests. And when conversation turned to films, her insights carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime shaping them. There is a certain poignancy in her invisibility during these years of greatest triumph. Audiences thrilled to Rear Window, gasped at Vertigo, delighted in To Catch a Thief. They spoke of Hitchcock as genius, never knowing that Alma had guided the very heartbeat of these films. Did she feel bitterness? Or did she see herself, as always, as part of the story rather than its author, content to be invisible so long as the work endured? Perhaps both. Perhaps she carried pride and sorrow together, as so many do whose labor remains unseen. The films of the 1950s remain as luminous now as when they first appeared, their suspense undiminished, their rhythm precise. Behind their brilliance lies the quiet image of Alma, pencil in hand, noting a misplaced gesture, a line too heavy, a scene too long. She corrected, refined, preserved coherence. Without her, the films might still have dazzled, but they would not have held the same perfection of rhythm. Her influence was the difference between brilliance and mastery. The chair at the dinner table remained slightly pulled away, its absence unresolved, and on Alma's desk a pair of scissors lay untouched, their blades open as though waiting for her hand to close them, waiting for the cut that would carry the story forward into new shapes. The scissors gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Their shadow stretched long across the page, promising another chapter, another refinement, another quiet correction that only Alma could make. The scissors lay open upon Alma's desk, their steel blades catching the lamplight, their shadow stretching across the papers like a silent crossroad, waiting for her hand to close them with decision. They seemed to embody the essence of her craft. Suspense paused mid-cut, an edit yet to be made, the choice between continuation and disruption balanced on the edge of steel. It was into this space of decision that Alma entered once more at the close of the 1950s, when Hitchcock conceived the film that would become both his most notorious and his most transformative, Psycho. The scissors, left open, might have been nothing more than a domestic detail, yet in their image we find an uncanny echo of the knife that would soon dominate cinema's most famous shower scene. Psycho began as a gamble. Adapted from Robert Bloch's novel, it was a story steeped in darkness, centering on an unassuming motel, a disturbed young man, and the brutal murder of a woman halfway through the narrative. Alfred was enthralled by the daring structure, by the audacity of killing the apparent heroine so suddenly, by the shock it would deliver to audiences. Studios doubted him. Producers hesitated. Censors prepared objections. Alma, as always, approached the project with calm precision. She saw the possibilities, but she also saw the dangers. A film so reliant on shock could easily falter if coherence was lost, if suspense dissolved into chaos. Her task was to refine, to correct, to ensure that the gamble did not collapse into failure. It was during the editing of the infamous shower scene that Alma's influence became legend, though still often unnamed. The sequence had been shot with meticulous care. Janet Leigh stepping into the bathroom, the water streaming, the curtain drawn, the sudden eruption of violence rendered through dozens of cuts rather than a single blow. Hitchcock was convinced of its brilliance, but when Alma watched the assembly, her sharp eye caught what no one else had noticed. A moment too long, a frame improperly trimmed. The audience might glimpse more than intended, breaking the illusion, shifting the scene from terror into something crude. Alma insisted upon the correction, guiding the cut so that the violence was suggested but never revealed in excess, so that the rhythm of attack and scream held perfect tension. It was this correction, this unseen adjustment, that ensured the scene's enduring power. What the world later hailed as Hitchcock's masterpiece of editing bore Alma's signature as surely as his. Beyond the shower scene, Alma's corrections threaded through the entire film. She noted when dialogue rang false, when pacing slackened, when continuity slipped. She refined the script to preserve ambiguity, ensuring that the truth of Norman Bates remained hidden until the end. She guided the performance of restraint, reminding Alfred that terror lay not in showing madness openly, but in letting it flicker just beneath the surface. And she reminded him, again, of the necessity of silence, the pause after the shower curtain falls, the long moment when the audience, breathless, realizes what has happened. These were Alma's instincts, the rhythms she had honed for decades. The success of Psycho was immediate and overwhelming. Audiences screamed, fainted, queued in long lines to experience its shocks. Critics debated its morality, its artistry, its audacity. The shower scene became a cultural landmark, studied and imitated endlessly. Hitchcock's name rose higher than ever, his reputation as Master of Suspense cemented beyond question. Alma's name, once again, was scarcely spoken, yet those who knew understood that without her, the film would not have held its coherence, its rhythm, its precision. The scissors upon her desk had closed with decision, and cinema itself was reshaped by their cut. At home, Alma remained as she always had, steady amid spectacle. The family laughed at the furor surrounding the film, Alfred enjoying the attention, Alma observing with quiet amusement. She took no credit, made no claim, but in her private moments she must have known that her correction had altered history, that her unseen hand had guided a scene that would never be forgotten. Did she feel pride? Likely. Did she feel sorrow at her invisibility? Perhaps. But above all, she remained devoted to the work, to the craft itself, to the rhythm of story. The 1960s brought further challenges. Hitchcock's fame grew ever more theatrical, his persona on television broadening his audience, his eccentricities sharpening. Alma's health began to waver, and her energies were no longer limitless. Yet she continued, advising on scripts, correcting continuity, preserving coherence. Alfred relied upon her still, admitting often that she was the only one he trusted completely. Their partnership, now decades old, endured not because of fame, but because of faith, his in her judgment, hers in his vision. The scissors, once open, had been closed upon the film, and yet their shadow remained. In their glint, we see the paradox of Alma's life, the tool always ready in her hand, the decision always hers, yet the credit always given to another. The shower scene may forever be remembered as Hitchcock's, but the truth lives in the small frame she cut away, the adjustment she demanded, the rhythm she preserved. It was Alma who ensured that terror endured without vulgarity, that suspense lived without collapse. Her correction was small, invisible, yet it carried the weight of genius. And so the scissors rested at last upon her desk, closed now, their shadow still stretched long. Outside, water dripped slowly in the quiet of an empty bathroom, each drop echoing like the heartbeat of suspense, each one reminding us that terror is born not from what we see, but from what remains suggested, unresolved, just beyond the edge of sight. The water dripped slowly in the quiet of an empty bathroom, each drop echoing against porcelain, with a rhythm that was neither hurried nor still, but something in between, a reminder of suspense suspended, of time itself waiting to be resolved. Alma heard such echoes in her own life as the years pressed into the 1960s and 1970s, when the vigor of earlier decades began to soften, and her body, once so steady, showed signs of frailty. The brilliance of their shared work had not dimmed, but the rhythm of life was changing, the shadows lengthening across both Alfred and Alma. The dripping water seemed almost to mark the slowing of their days, each drop a memory of what had been, each pause a question of what remained. Illness touched Alma quietly at first, then with more insistence. She suffered from breast cancer, endured surgery, endured recovery. Alfred, often so wrapped in his own world of stories and fears, was shaken by the thought of her absence. For all his eccentricities, for all his fame, he was utterly dependent upon her. The idea of working without Alma was inconceivable to him, not because she was merely supportive, but because she was the one who steadied his life, who corrected his art, who knew him more fully than he knew himself. When she fell ill, Alfred's world trembled. He sat at her bedside, fretful, unmoored, the master of suspense reduced to a man terrified of loss. Alma, patient even in illness, bore it with quiet courage, her wit intact, her calm presence undiminished. During her convalescence, Hitchcock's work slowed. He had projects in motion, but his mind returned again and again to Alma's side. Colleagues noticed his distraction, his nervousness, his inability to function without her. It was Alma who urged him not to surrender to despair, Alma who steadied him even as she herself endured pain. Their bond, forged in the cutting rooms of the silent era, tempered through decades of films and domesticity, revealed itself most clearly now. Theirs was not simply a marriage of convenience, nor a collaboration of art, but a partnership of survival. When Alma recovered, at least for a time, Hitchcock resumed his work with renewed energy. Films like The Birds and Marnie emerged in these years, both daring in concept, both fraught with challenges. Alma, though no longer able to give the exhaustive attention of earlier decades, continued to advise, to correct, to preserve coherence. In The Birds, she helped refine the pacing of menace, ensuring that suspense did not collapse into repetition. In Marnie, she urged greater clarity of character, though the film's troubled production limited what even she could save. Still, her influence remained, quieter now, yet indispensable. At home, their life took on a slower rhythm. Patricia married, began her own family, and Alma, now grandmother as well as mother, found comfort in the presence of children once more. She cooked, she told stories, she nurtured. Alfred, often anxious and restless, leaned heavily on her steadiness. In gatherings, they still sat together, she with her dry wit, he with his theatrics. Their friends understood that behind Alfred's performance was Alma's quiet authority, unspoken but absolute. The world beyond them changed swiftly. The 1960s brought cultural upheaval, new forms of cinema, new voices rising. Hitchcock, though still revered, felt at times out of step, his style questioned, his relevance debated. Alma encouraged him, reminded him of his strengths, urged him to adapt without surrendering coherence. He listened, as always, more to her than to anyone else. Yet he too was aging, his health faltering, his energies waning. Together they faced not only the shifting world of cinema, but the approach of their own twilight. The dripping of water in an empty bathroom echoed still, marking time. Alma moved more slowly, her body no longer agile, her days more confined. Yet her mind remained sharp, her humor undimmed. Even when illness returned, she offered Alfred counsel, reminded him of continuity, corrected his scripts with pencil marks made from bed. It is said that her influence on his final projects was still decisive, though often unseen by others. She never relinquished the role she had played all her life, the quiet guardian of coherence, the unseen author of rhythm. As Alfred's health declined in the 1970s, the roles reversed in some ways. Alma, though frail, became his emotional anchor, encouraging him to continue, to endure. They lived in near seclusion, the noise of Hollywood distant, their days marked by routine, by companionship, by memory. Visitors who came remarked on their intimacy, their quiet jokes, their lifelong bond. For all the fame, all the spectacle, it was here, in the ordinary quiet of shared rooms, that their true genius lay, the genius of sustaining one another through decades of change. When Alfred died in 1980, the world mourned him as one of cinema's greatest artists, the master of suspense, the genius of image and rhythm. Alma, widowed, remained in quiet seclusion. She lived another 2 years, passing in 1982, her death closing a partnership that had spanned more than half a century. The world remembered her mostly as his wife, some as his collaborator, few as his equal. Yet those who knew, those who looked closely at the films themselves, understood that her presence was woven into their very fabric. The dripping water fell silent at last. The faucet turned. The echo ceased. The bathroom stood empty, its tiles cool, its curtain drawn. Yet in the silence left behind lingered the rhythm of suspense, the coherence of story, the balance of silence and sound that Alma had preserved all her life. It was as though she had left her signature not in credits or in applause, but in the very pauses between notes, the shadows between images, the silences between words. Her genius lay not in visibility but in endurance, not in spectacle, but in rhythm. And so Alma's story, though often hidden, remains. It is told not in her name, but in the films themselves, in the precise edits, the careful pauses, the balance of terror and restraint. She was the unseen hand that closed the scissors, that freed the stuck typewriter key, that steadied the dinner table, that preserved the coherence of a genius. Without her, Hitchcock would not have been Hitchcock. With her, cinema became something it had never been before. The water no longer dripped, but the silence it left behind was not empty. It was filled with memory, with rhythm, with the presence of Alma Reville, the woman behind suspense, the woman whose influence endures unseen, like the faint sound that remains in the ear after the final note has faded. The silence left behind when the dripping ceased was not empty, but full, as though it contained within it every echo that had ever passed through Alma's life. It was the kind of silence that follows the closing of a book or the darkening of a cinema screen after the last reel has ended. In that stillness one does not hear nothing, but instead hears everything. The remembered footsteps on staircases, the soft creak of doors opening, the whispered words left unfinished, the laughter from another room, the faint tap of pencil against script. This was Alma's silence, a silence that held within it her entire legacy, invisible yet unforgotten. When she passed in 1982, just 2 years after Alfred, the world noted her departure with polite words. Obituaries spoke of her as the director's wife, occasionally as a collaborator, sometimes as a screenwriter of her own early standing. Few articles lingered on her decisive influence. Fewer still on the reality that without her, there could have been no Hitchcock as the world knew him. Yet those who had worked with her remembered. Editors recalled her precision, actors remembered her wit, producers knew her as the calm presence who made difficult projects possible. And Alfred himself, in interviews before his death, had acknowledged her with an honesty rare for him. She was indispensable. The audience never saw her, yet she was always present, like the hand that draws a curtain without being seen on stage. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine what Alma might have felt about her invisibility. Did she regret never receiving the acclaim, the fame, the awards? Did she wish that her name might have been spoken alongside his, that she might have stood on stages and accepted applause? Perhaps she did, in fleeting moments of quiet. But perhaps she also knew that her genius was of a different order, not to be seen, but to shape what was seen, not to be heard, but to guide what was heard. Her artistry lay in invisibility, and perhaps she accepted that truth more deeply than we can. For suspense itself, the art she perfected, depends upon invisibility. It is what is hidden, not what is shown, that gives it force. Alma, invisible, became the very embodiment of the art she shaped. Her legacy lingers in every Hitchcock film, from The Silent Shadow of the Lodger to the screaming silence of Psycho. It lingers in the pauses that stretch just long enough to unsettle, in the dialogues trimmed to their essential bones, in the scenes that flow without falter. It lingers in the balance between spectacle and restraint, in the humanity preserved within the darkest tales. If Hitchcock was the architect, Alma was the engineer, the one who ensured the structure stood, who tested its balance, who corrected its flaws. Without her, the edifice might have collapsed. With her, it endured. And beyond film, her legacy lingers in the image of partnership itself. In a world that celebrates solitary genius, Alma and Alfred remind us that genius is often a duet, a conversation, a collaboration hidden from view. He may have been the face, but she was the conscience. He may have carried the name, but she carried the balance. Together they created not only films, but a life, sustained across decades by patience, wit, and mutual trust. In this sense, their story is as much about marriage as about cinema, as much about the quiet strength of companionship as about the brilliance of suspense. Even today, when scholars revisit Hitchcock's films, they find Alma there, like a shadow glimpsed at the edge of the frame. They find her in the edits, in the scripts, in the rhythms. They speak her name more often now, acknowledging what was once ignored. Yet even this recognition cannot fully restore her, for her artistry was always designed to be unseen. She is like the cut that makes the scene flow, the silence that makes the sound ring truer, the shadow that makes the light more vivid. One cannot separate her from the work. She is the invisible fabric of it. What remains most haunting is the thought of Alma in her final years, living quietly after Alfred's death, surrounded by memories, by reels of films she had helped shape, by the echoes of laughter and suspense that had filled her life. Did she sit sometimes in the evening, watching one of their films on television, seeing not only the story but the marks of her own hand within it? Did she recall the moments when she had corrected a line, trimmed a frame, urged restraint? Did she feel pride or sorrow or both? Perhaps she simply smiled faintly as she always did, content that the work endured. The silence after the dripping ceased carries us here, into reflection not only upon her life, but upon the nature of art itself. So much of what endures in the world is shaped by those who remain unseen. Editors, advisors, partners, caretakers, all leave their mark invisibly, their labor hidden behind the names that history elevates. Alma's story is the story of all such lives, a reminder that genius is never solitary, that brilliance is never born alone. She stands as a symbol of the countless whose work remains in shadow, whose presence is felt but not named. And so, when the screen fades to black and the credits roll, we might imagine her name written there, not in small letters or in passing, but in silence itself. For silence was always her art, her voice, her legacy. It is in silence that suspense lives, and it is in silence that Alma Reville remains. The screen is dark now, the theater empty, the echoes of applause faded. Yet from the quiet corner of the room comes the faintest sound of paper being turned, a script waiting to be read once more, a pencil waiting to mark its margin. The story is not over, for Alma's hand still lingers in the rhythm of cinema, unseen yet essential, waiting always to guide the next cut. The faint turning of paper in the quiet of an empty room, a page shifting as though carried by a hand no longer present, seems to summon Alma once more, not only as herself, but as a figure of something larger, as a presence shared with countless others whose labor was hidden behind brighter names. For Alma was not alone in her invisibility. The history of cinema, like the history of art in every age, is filled with women whose hands shaped the work while their names remained absent. In her story, we glimpse theirs, and in theirs we find her reflected again, as though the paper she once marked with pencil bore not one signature, but many invisible ones. From the silent era onward, women had been there, in cutting rooms where the light flickered, in offices where scripts were shaped, in studios where continuity was guarded with precision. Editors, screenwriters, script supervisors, these were roles often entrusted to women, for the industry recognized their patience, their attention to detail, their discipline. Yet these same qualities, so essential to the art, were used also as reasons to diminish them, to call their work secondary, supportive, invisible. Alma had risen from these very ranks, a young girl in Nottingham who began by mending reels, by learning the rhythm of continuity, by finding her place in a profession that quietly depended upon women even as it denied them recognition. Her journey was singular, yet it was also shared. To speak of Alma, then, is to speak of all those who sat for long hours with scissors and reels, trimming, splicing, ensuring that stories flowed. It is to speak of those who checked costumes for continuity, who corrected lines of dialogue, who shaped the invisible threads that held films together. Their names, like hers, were rarely spoken. Yet without them, cinema would have been incoherent, its brilliance fractured, its stories untrustworthy. Alma embodied this silent lineage. She was its most visible, invisible figure, a paradox in herself, central yet hidden, indispensable yet unnamed. Her presence within this wider history suggests something profound about the nature of suspense itself. Suspense is not a matter of spectacle alone. It is born of rhythm, of timing, of what is withheld rather than what is displayed. Who better to preserve such subtleties than those whose very lives were shaped by invisibility? Women in early cinema, Alma among them, knew instinctively the power of what remains unseen. Their labor mirrored the very essence of suspense, quiet, hidden, shaping fear, not through display, but through silence. In this way, Alma's life is not merely a story of one woman behind one man, but a story of invisibility as artistry, of absence as presence. As Hitchcock's collaborator, Alma carried this inheritance into the heart of the 20th century's most celebrated films. Yet even now, when scholars name her, when retrospectives honor her, it is easy to forget how many others remain unnamed still. She becomes a doorway, a reminder to look beyond the credits, to see in the rhythm of film the countless unseen hands. Perhaps this is the truest form of her legacy, not only the films themselves, but the questions she leaves us with. How many Almas shape the art we love, and how many names remain unspoken? The paper turning faintly in that empty room invites us to imagine her at her desk again, marking a script, her pencil tracing the margins. Yet now, instead of her alone, the room fills with other figures, editors in silent-era cutting rooms, typists revising dialogue, continuity supervisors noting details across endless pages. Their presence gathers like shadows at the edge of the lamplight, silent, watchful, essential. Alma sits among them, neither more nor less than they, part of a collective labor that cinema has too often hidden. Together they represent the invisible architecture of film, the unseen scaffolding upon which masterpieces stand. And what of recognition? It comes late, if at all. Alma herself did not live to see her role widely celebrated. Only in recent years has her name been spoken with the respect it deserves. Yet perhaps she understood something we are still learning, that invisibility does not erase significance, that absence does not mean silence. Her genius was to work unseen and yet to shape what all could see. She teaches us that history itself must be re-edited, cut anew, its silences filled, its invisibilities revealed. As the page settles, the faint whisper of its turning fades, and in the stillness that follows we might hear the echo of her laughter, wry and understated, as though amused by all this attention, so long delayed, for Alma never demanded the spotlight. Her wit thrived on understatement, her artistry on restraint. To celebrate her now is not to change who she was, but to understand at last what she always embodied, that the greatest influence is often invisible, that the truest artistry lies in balance, that suspense itself is an art of silence. The page remains open, waiting, its margins wide. Alma's pencil hovers above it, joined now by the imagined pencils of countless others. The story continues, not as a single narrative, but as many, not as a solitary genius, but as a chorus of hidden voices. and in the gathering quiet we sense that the story of Alma Reville is not ending, but widening, carrying her presence outward into the larger memory of cinema, where invisibility itself becomes a form of remembrance. The page, though still, holds weight, as though ready to be turned again, carrying us toward the closing of her story, where silence itself becomes the final word, and where Alma's shadow stretches not only across Hitchcock's films, but across the entire history of the unseen in art. The page waited, its surface wide and pale, the margins unmarked, the faint weight of expectation pressing upon it as though it knew it would be the last. Alma's pencil hovered above, not in her hand but in the memory of it, as if the story itself longed for her to return and inscribe one final note before silence closed around it. This is how endings arrive, not with a declaration but with a pause, a lingering, a sense that what has been told is not gone, but folded carefully away, ready to be remembered when the light flickers again on a screen. Alma's life, so often hidden, so often unspoken, cannot be concluded in applause or spectacle. It must end as it was lived, quietly, precisely, invisibly, yet with a weight that endures far beyond its shadow. In the years since her passing, her name has risen slowly, like a whisper gathering force, acknowledged more often by scholars, filmmakers, historians. Where once she was called only the director's wife, she is now recognized as collaborator, editor, screenwriter, conscience. Yet even this recognition cannot fully capture the essence of her presence. For Alma was never simply a woman in the background. She was the rhythm within the silence, the hand that steadied the cut, the voice that spoke truth when others remained silent. She was the unseen heartbeat of suspense, and though her name was small in the credits, her influence filled every frame. To tell her story is also to reflect upon the nature of memory. What do we remember, and what do we forget? Whose names are written, and whose are erased? Alma's life reminds us that history is always partial, that behind every name celebrated lie countless others who shaped the work but were never seen. She becomes a symbol of that vast, unseen labor, not only in cinema but in all of art, in all of life. To remember Alma is to remember them, to honor the invisible, to acknowledge that what we see is never the whole of what has been made. And yet Alma herself might have smiled faintly at such reflection, amused at the fuss. She was not one to seek grand pronouncements. Her humor was dry, her wit understated. If asked about her legacy, she might have replied with a single precise remark, cutting through sentiment with clarity. Perhaps she would have said that it was enough that the films worked, that the stories held, that the audiences believed. Perhaps she would have reminded us that suspense itself depends upon silence, that invisibility is not absence, but artistry. Perhaps she would have let the question pass altogether, turning instead to the next page, the next cut, the next correction waiting to be made. Still, we are left with images, faint but enduring. Alma at her desk, pencil in hand, marking a script late into the night. Alma in the cutting room, eyes narrowed as reels turned, noting with precision the frame that must be trimmed. Alma at the dinner table, quiet but decisive, offering a remark that steadied the room. Alma in her later years, frail yet still sharp, offering Alfred the guidance he needed even when her own strength was waning. Alma passing finally into silence, her name spoken softly by those who knew, her presence felt in every film she had touched. These images remain, flickering like frames upon a reel, each one unfinished, each one lingering. What is suspense but the refusal of closure, the insistence that something remains unresolved? Alma's life ends, yet her influence does not. It lingers in the rhythm of films, still watched, in the shadows that stretch across screens, in the silences that unsettle our hearts. It lingers in every cut that feels inevitable, in every pause that tightens the breath, in every story that holds together because someone, unseen, ensured its coherence. To watch a Hitchcock film is to see Alma's hand, whether we know it or not. She is there in the unseen, which was always her art, and so the page remains open, waiting, though no new words will be written upon it. The silence that follows is not empty, but full, filled with memory, with rhythm, with the unseen presence of Alma Reville. Her story does not end with applause or finality. It ends as all her work ended, quietly, invisibly, precisely, leaving behind something greater than herself, something that endures. The films remain, the suspense remains, the rhythm remains, Alma remains. The pencil, no longer hovering, rests now upon the desk, its tip dulled from long use, its shadow stretching faintly across the waiting page. Outside, the world continues. Voices rise and fade, lights flicker and darken, and in the stillness that follows, we hear at last the true measure of Alma's life, not in what was seen, but in what was unseen, not in the words spoken, but in the silence that held them, not in the name remembered, but in the rhythm that endures long after. The page waits still, though no hand will turn it, and in that waiting lies the final truth of Alma's story, that invisibility is not erasure, that silence is not absence, that her legacy, though unseen, will never cease to shape the stories we tell. Word count, 1291.